This is 3 hours of Family Guy lore to fall asleep to. Let's get started with the Griffin house, explained. So the Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island. Just a regular-looking 2-story house in a regular-looking neighbourhood with a regular-looking front yard. And the show acts like this is a completely normal address in a completely normal town, except Quahog doesn't exist. Rhode Island is real, obviously, but Quahog is a made-up place that Seth MacFarlane invented because he went to the Rhode Island School of Design and thought the state was funny enough to set a show in. The whole town is named after a type of clam. That's the level of seriousness we're working with here. A fictional town named after shellfish, where a 300-pound man lives with his family and a talking dog, and the show presents this like it's just another suburb in New England. But here's where things get weird. The house at 31 Spooner Street might be the most architecturally confused building in all of animation. If you've watched enough episodes, you've probably noticed that the layout of this house changes constantly. The staircase moves sides, rooms appear and disappear depending on what the plot needs. Stewie's bedroom is sometimes right next to Peter and Lois's room, and other times it's across the hall or down a completely different corridor. The basement exists when someone needs to find an old script down there or hide from something, and then it just vanishes for the next 30 episodes like it was never there. There's an attic that shows up exactly when the writers need a panic room scene or a place to store old junk, and then it stops existing entirely. Think about that for a second. The Griffins have been living in this house for over 2 decades of television, and nobody has ever established a consistent floor plan. The Simpsons house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has a layout that fans have actually mapped out in detail. You can draw a blueprint of the Simpson house, and it would mostly hold up from episode to episode. Try that with 31 Spooner Street, and you'd need a completely different blueprint for every season. Maybe every episode. The house literally shapeshifts to accommodate whatever joke or story is happening that week. The living room is probably the most important room in the entire show. More scenes happen in that living room than in any other location in Quahog. Peter sits on that couch watching TV, and that's where roughly half of the show's comedy gets generated. He sees something on the screen, makes a comment, and boom, we're in a cutaway gag. The couch is basically the launch pad for the show's entire comedic structure. Without that couch and that TV, you lose the mechanism that triggers most of the random flashbacks and tangents that make Family Guy what it is. It's like the engine room of the whole operation, except the engine is a fat guy in a white shirt watching something stupid and going, "You know what? This reminds me of the time." The TV itself has been through more abuse than any electronic device in fiction. Peter has thrown things at it, shot it, crashed through the wall behind it, and somehow it always comes back in perfect working condition by the next scene. In one episode, the family actually loses the TV when Lois sells it to afford Christmas presents, and Peter acts like someone removed one of his vital organs. He can't function without it. The show even had Kevin James show up because Peter was supposedly his last viewer. And without Peter watching network television, Kevin's physical body started disappearing. That's how important the TV at 31 Spooner Street is. It's not just entertainment for Peter, it's apparently keeping sitcom actors alive through sheer viewership. Now let's talk about the bedrooms, because they tell you everything about how the show treats each character. Peter and Lois have a master bedroom that's pretty standard. Nothing too fancy, nothing too weird. It looks like what you'd expect from a middle-class couple in Rhode Island. But Stewie's room is where things get genuinely insane. This is a 1-year-old baby's bedroom that contains a time machine, ray guns, mind control devices, a teleportation pad, and what appears to be a small armory of weapons capable of destroying civilization. Nobody notices. Lois walks past this room every single day and apparently sees nothing unusual about the fact that her infant son has technology that would make NASA weep with jealousy. In one episode, Lois actually finds the time machine while decluttering and just drags it out of his room like it's an old piece of furniture. She doesn't question what it is or why a baby has it. She just wants the room to be cleaner. Chris's room exists but barely gets featured. When it does show up, it's exactly what you'd expect from a teenage boy who isn't very bright. Posters on the walls, messy floor, nothing particularly interesting. And then there's Meg's room, which the show treats with the same contempt it treats Meg herself. Her room barely exists in the show's geography. It's mentioned occasionally, referenced when necessary, but the camera almost never goes there. The house's architectural neglect of Meg's space mirrors the family's emotional neglect of Meg as a person. Even the building itself seems to forget she lives there. The house has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that it should probably be condemned by whatever passes for a building inspector in Quahog. In the Y2K episode, Da Boom, a nuclear explosion levels basically the entire town, and the Griffins have to travel to Natick, Massachusetts to find a Twinkie factory. Their house is completely gone. In dozens of other episodes, Peter crashes vehicles through walls, explosions tear through rooms, the structural integrity of the building gets compromised in ways that would require months of construction to repair. Once, Peter literally knocked the house off its foundation. The damage is catastrophic almost every time. And then in the next episode, everything's fine. The house is back, the walls are intact, the furniture is in place. Nobody mentions the fact that the entire second floor was missing last week. This is basically the Family Guy version of the SpongeBob Pineapple House phenomenon. Both houses exist because the characters need somewhere to live, and the shows absolutely refuse to let reality interfere with that arrangement. SpongeBob's pineapple can regrow from a single seed watered by tears. The Griffin house regenerates between episodes through the power of simply not acknowledging that anything happened. It's a different kind of magic. SpongeBob's world has an in-universe explanation for why the house comes back. Family Guy doesn't even bother with an explanation. The house is back because the house needs to be back. End of discussion. What's really interesting is how the house reflects the show's philosophy about continuity in general. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with its own timeline. Characters age and then unage. Events happen and then get contradicted. Peter's backstory changes depending on which episode you're watching. The house embodies all of this perfectly. It's a physical structure that refuses to be pinned down to any consistent reality because the show itself refuses to be pinned down. The Simpsons maintained a relatively stable world. South Park has ongoing storylines that build on each other. Family Guy treats continuity like a suggestion that it's free to ignore whenever a better joke comes along. The neighbourhood around 31 Spooner Street is its own little ecosystem. Cleveland used to live next door before he moved away for the Cleveland show and then came back. Joe Swanson lives nearby with Bonnie. Quagmire is right there too. These four houses form the core social circle of the show, and the proximity is important because it means Peter can wander over to any of his friends' houses at any time for any reason. The neighbourhood is designed for maximum comedic convenience. Everyone Peter needs is within walking distance, which means the show never has to waste time on travel or logistics. Peter wants to hang out with the guys, he walks outside. Done. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their social time, is apparently also close to Spooner Street. The Pawtucket Brewery, where Peter works, is nearby. James Woods High School, where the kids go, is in the area. Everything in Peter's life exists within this tight little radius around his house, and that's by design. The show created a world where the main character the family eventually moves back to their regular house in Quahog after Peter discovers that Cherrywood Manor was actually a famous brothel. He sells the photos to the tabloids and uses the money to buy back their old house. Think about the economics of that for a second. Peter sold his house to move to a mansion, then sold embarrassing photos of the mansion to buy back the house he'd already sold. The whole housing situation in the Griffin family is held together by coincidences, scams, and Peter's ability to stumble into money at exactly the right moment. This is a family that should have been homeless multiple times over. They've faced financial ruin in dozens of episodes. Peter gets fired constantly. He spends money on insane projects and schemes. The house should have been foreclosed on years ago, but it persists. 31 Spooner Street endures because the show needs it to endure. And Peter's financial incompetence gets magically resolved before anyone has to pack boxes. In one episode, Peter actually takes out a reverse mortgage after seeing a Tom Selleck commercial, which puts the house at risk. In another, he spends the family's vacation money on a homemade jetpack. In yet another, he buys a boat he can't afford. The financial stress on this household is constant and severe, but the house always survives. It's the most resilient piece of real estate in animated television. Fires, explosions, car crashes, nuclear apocalypses, financial disasters, and the general chaos of having Peter Griffin as a homeowner. None of it can destroy 31 Spooner Street permanently. The address itself has become iconic in the same way that 742 Evergreen Terrace is iconic for The Simpsons, or 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is for the president. 31 Spooner Street is shorthand for the Griffin family, for Quahog, for the entire world of Family Guy. When you picture that house, you picture the couch, the TV, Peter sitting there in his white shirt and green pants, and you know exactly what kind of show you're about to watch. The house is the first thing the audience sees in almost every episode, and it's the last thing they see when the credits roll. It's not just a building, it's a framing device. It tells you that no matter how crazy things got in the previous 22 minutes, everyone made it home safely, and everything is back to normal. That's the genius of 31 Spooner Street. It's not architecturally consistent. It's not financially plausible. It's not structurally sound. But it's emotionally consistent. It always feels like the Griffin house, no matter how many times it gets destroyed or rearranged. It's where Stewie builds his inventions and plots against Lois. It's where Brian drinks martinis and pretends to be intellectual. It's where Chris hides from his problems and Meg gets ignored. It's where Peter watches TV and triggers cutaway gags that have nothing to do with anything. The house works because the family works, and the family works because they always have somewhere to come home to. Even if that somewhere has a different floor plan every time they walk through the door. And honestly, that's probably the most realistic thing about the show. How many people can draw an accurate floor plan of their own house from memory? You'd probably get some rooms wrong. Forget about a closet, misplace a window. The Griffin house just takes that normal human imprecision and cranks it up to cartoon levels. Every viewer's mental image of 31 Spooner Street is slightly different because the show itself can't decide what the house looks like. And somehow, that makes it more relatable, not less. It's everyone's house and nobody's house at the same time. Now let's talk about something that's confused fans for over 20 years. How smart is Peter Griffin really? Peter Griffin might be the most confusingly written character in all of television. And I don't mean confusing in a bad way. I mean confusing in the way where you finish watching an episode and genuinely cannot tell whether this man is the dumbest person alive or some kind of accidental genius who stumbled into being right about everything. Because the show can't decide either, and that's actually what makes him work. Let's start with the facts. In the episode Petarded, Peter takes a standardized test and scores so low that he's officially classified as mentally retarded. That's the show's word, not mine. The state literally declares him intellectually disabled and too incompetent to be a parent. His children get taken away by Child Protective Services and placed with Cleveland because Peter is deemed unfit to raise them. This is played for comedy, obviously, but the show commits to the premise hard enough that it sticks. Peter Griffin is, on paper, not intelligent enough to function as a responsible adult. The government said so, but here's where it falls apart. Because in the same show where Peter can't pass a basic intelligence test, he also somehow manages to do things that require genuine smarts. Not book smarts maybe, but some kind of weird chaotic intelligence that lets him navigate situations that would stump most people. In Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, a cigarette company makes Peter the president of a toy company because they think he's too dumb to cause problems. Their entire strategy is built on the idea that Peter won't understand what's happening. But then Peter goes to Congress and manages to deliver a speech that convinces the assembled legislators to fine the company $100 million. He bankrupts them. This is the same guy who scored below the intellectual disability threshold on a standardized test, and he's somehow able to outmaneuver a billion-dollar tobacco corporation in Washington, D.C. You see this pattern everywhere. Peter is consistently portrayed as someone who can barely remember his own children's names. But then he'll execute an elaborate scheme that requires planning, timing, and social manipulation. He's talked his way out of jail. He's started businesses. He's run for political office. He's manipulated situations to get exactly what he wants, even when what he wants is stupid and self-destructive. There's a difference between being dumb and being successful, despite being dumb, and Peter lives entirely in that gap. The Pawtucket Brewery job is a perfect example. Peter works at this brewery for most of the series. He's been fired and rehired more times than anyone can count. In one episode, he gets demoted to working under a mentally handicapped man who is more qualified than he is, which is the show explicitly telling you that Peter is professionally incompetent even by the lowest possible standards. But he keeps coming back. He keeps being employed. He's lasted at this job for decades of showtime, through multiple management changes, corporate takeovers, and complete restructurings. How does a man who's been officially classified as intellectually disabled maintain employment for that long? Either the Pawtucket Brewery has the worst HR department in America, or Peter has some survival instinct that keeps him afloat despite everything working against him. Then there's the most interesting man in the world, which is maybe the most telling episode about Peter's intelligence. Lois catches him being a terrible father and calls him an idiot, and it actually hurts his feelings this time. So Quagmire suggests Peter broaden his horizons. Peter starts taking business trips to Chicago and using the free time to visit museums, cultural exhibits, and educational institutions. He comes back refined, cultured, articulate. He's reading books instead of watching TV. He's discussing art and literature with the family. He's suddenly this sophisticated person that nobody recognizes. But here's the kicker. Lois hates it. The family hates it. Smart Peter is annoying. He replaces the television with a bookcase, and the whole family falls apart. Lois starts sneaking TV, watching behind his back. The guys at the bar can't stand being around him, so Lois sends him to Tucson, which is apparently the dumbest place she can think of, and he comes back normal. The episode's message is pretty clear. Peter can be smart. He's capable of intelligence. He just chooses not to be, because the world he lives in works better when he's dumb. His stupidity isn't a limitation. It's a lifestyle choice that everyone around him has tacitly agreed to support. That changes everything about how you watch the show. If Peter is choosing to be dumb, or if his environment is shaping him to be dumb, then every stupid thing he does becomes more complicated. Is he really incapable of understanding that you shouldn't pour hot grease on your wife? Or is he just so deeply embedded in his identity as the lovable idiot that he can't break character? The show never gives you a definitive answer because the ambiguity is the joke. Seth MacFarlane based Peter's voice on a security guard he overheard at the Rhode Island School of Design. Just some random guy talking in a distinctive way, and MacFarlane thought it was funny enough to build an entire character around. There's something fitting about that. Peter Griffin started as an impression of a real person, and the character has the same kind of inconsistency that real people have. Real people are smart in some situations and stupid in others. They make brilliant observations and then do incredibly dumb things 5 minutes later. Peter just operates at the extreme ends of that spectrum. Consider how Peter handles money. He's terrible with it. He spends the family's vacation fund on a jetpack. He buys boats he can't afford. He takes out reverse mortgages after seeing Tom Selleck commercials. He's bought a helicopter, started businesses on a whim, and funded elaborate pranks that cost thousands of dollars. The family should be bankrupt. They should have lost the house years ago, but Peter always manages to land on his feet, usually through some combination of luck, audacity, and other people cleaning up his messes. In the Pretty Patties situation, wait, that's SpongeBob. Let me get back on track. Peter's financial incompetence mirrors his intellectual inconsistency perfectly. He's bad with money in the same way he's bad with intelligence. Not consistently bad, unpredictably bad. He'll make the worst possible financial decision in one episode, and then somehow generate enough money to solve a completely different problem in the next episode. He sold embarrassing photos of Lois's ancestral home to tabloids and used the money to buy back their house. He accidentally became a folk hero and monetized it. He's found loopholes, exploited systems, and stumbled into windfalls with a regularity that would make an actual financial advisor suspicious. The other characters in the show seem to understand Peter's inconsistency on some level, even if they don't acknowledge it directly. Lois married this man knowing who he is. She's seen him at his absolute dumbest and at his occasionally smartest, and she stays because she's made peace with the chaos. Brian, who is supposed to be the intellectual of the household, regularly gets outsmarted by Peter in social situations. Brian can quote philosophy and reference obscure novels, but Peter can read a room and manipulate people in ways that Brian never could. There's a street intelligence to Peter that no IQ test would ever capture. Even Stewie, the literal genius baby, sometimes defers to Peter's judgment in weird ways. Not because Peter is right, but because Peter's approach to problems, which is essentially to charge forward without thinking and deal with consequences later, sometimes works better than Stewie's elaborate calculations. Stewie plans for years and builds complex technology. Peter just does stuff. And sometimes doing stuff without planning is more effective than planning without doing stuff. The funniest theory about Peter's intelligence comes from looking at the show's structure itself. Peter is exactly as smart as the current joke needs him to be. Need someone to not understand a basic word? Peter's an idiot. Need someone to deliver a cutting observation about American culture? Peter's suddenly perceptive. Need someone to build a functioning pirate ship or execute a complex heist? Peter's capable. The character isn't written with a consistent intelligence level, because a consistent intelligence level would limit the kinds of jokes the show can tell. Peter's IQ is a sliding scale, and it slides based on what's funniest in any given moment. This is fundamentally different from how other animated shows handle their dumb dad characters. Homer Simpson is consistently average to below average in intelligence, with occasional moments of clarity. Homer's stupidity has rules. There are things Homer would never understand, and things Homer might figure out if given enough time. Peter doesn't have those rules. Peter can go from being unable to spell his own name to delivering a speech in Congress within the same season. The gap between his floor and his ceiling is wider than any other character in animation. Some fans have tried to explain this with theories about brain damage. Peter has taken more hits to the head than a professional boxer. He's been in car accidents, explosions, fights with a giant chicken, falls from incredible heights, and direct impacts with various objects at high velocity. If you tracked every head injury Peter has sustained across the series, you'd probably have enough concussions to write a medical textbook. Maybe his intelligence fluctuates because his brain is literally damaged in different ways at different times. One concussion makes him dumber. Another one happens to hit the right spot and temporarily makes him sharper. It's not a great theory, but it's not worse than any other explanation. The Peter Hitler bit from the Griffin family history gives us another angle on Peter's intelligence. Peter's great-uncle, Peter Hitler, is depicted as annoying but not stupid. He's capable enough to have a normal life and accidentally get his brother killed, which requires at least some baseline level of competence. The Griffin family doesn't have a genetic tradition of stupidity. Peter's ancestors include people who invented things, founded towns, and manipulated historical events. The intelligence is in the bloodline somewhere. It just expresses itself in Peter as this weird, chaotic energy that's never consistent enough to be useful. What really gets me is how Peter handles emotional intelligence compared to regular intelligence. He's terrible at facts, logic, planning, and self-awareness, but he's genuinely good at understanding what makes people tick. He knows exactly how to push Cleveland's buttons. He understands Lois's emotional needs well enough to manipulate her when he wants something. He can read Quagmire's insecurities like a book. He even has moments of genuine emotional insight with his kids, usually right before ruining everything. Peter's emotional IQ exists on a completely different scale from his regular IQ, and the gap between them is one of the show's most consistent sources of comedy. In the end, Peter Griffin's intelligence is probably the most accurate thing about the show, even though it seems like the most unrealistic. People are complicated. They're smart about some things and stupid about others. They make brilliant decisions and then immediately make terrible ones. They can navigate complex social situations while being completely unable to manage basic life tasks. Peter is just all of that cranked up to the most extreme version possible. He's not dumb or smart, he's both, simultaneously, depending on what the universe needs from him at that exact moment. And honestly, that's more human than any consistent characterization could ever be. The real question isn't how smart Peter Griffin is. It's why we keep asking. The show has been telling us for over 2 decades that Peter's intelligence doesn't have a fixed point, and we keep looking for one anyway. We want him to be consistently dumb so we can feel superior to him, or consistently smart so we can root for him. But Peter refuses to be either. He's just Peter. Sometimes brilliant, usually ridiculous, always Peter, and the show wouldn't work any other way. But speaking of things that don't make sense in Quahog, let's talk about Peter's most iconic recurring nemesis. And no, it's not some criminal mastermind, it's a chicken. The Peter Griffin versus Ernie the Giant Chicken rivalry might be the most perfectly stupid thing in all of television. And I mean that as the highest possible compliment, because the chicken fights aren't just random gags, they're an entire philosophy of comedy, expressed through 2 idiots beating the absolute life out of each other for increasingly insane reasons across increasingly insane locations, and the show commits to them so hard that they've become their own genre of entertainment. It all started with a coupon. That's it. That's the origin story of one of the longest-running recurring gags in animation history. Ernie the Giant Chicken gave Peter an expired coupon, and Peter took that personally. Not like a normal person would take it personally, where you'd be mildly annoyed and throw the coupon away. Peter took it personally in the way that only Peter Griffin can, which means immediate, catastrophic violence with zero regard for collateral damage, property destruction, or the basic laws of physics. The first fight was relatively contained. It happened in the neighbourhood. Peter and this enormous chicken in a dress shirt and tie just started throwing punches on the sidewalk, and it escalated from there. They crashed through windows, rolled down streets, knocked over trash cans. It was absurd, it was way longer than it needed to be, and it came out of absolutely nowhere in the middle of an episode that had nothing to do with chickens. The cutaway just happened, the fight played out, and then the show moved on like nothing weird had occurred. No explanation for why there's a human-sized chicken walking around Quahog. No explanation for why Peter's first response to an expired coupon is attempted murder. Just violence, then back to the plot. And that would have been enough. A one-time gag about a guy fighting a chicken. Funny, weird, move on. But the writers realised they had something special, because the audience went nuts for it. So the chicken came back, and back, and back again. And every single time, the fights got bigger, more elaborate, more expensive looking, and more ridiculously over the top. By the time you get to the fight in No Chris Left Behind, Peter and Ernie are destroying entire city blocks. Their battle ranges from the Griffin house through the sewers, onto a subway train, over the steel beams of a high-rise construction site, up into a biplane, crashing into a giant Ferris wheel that gets knocked off its platform and rolls through the streets, crushing everything in its path. The fight continues on top of the rolling Ferris wheel until it demolishes a 10-story apartment building. That's not a joke fight. That's a Michael Bay movie. That's a $100 million action sequence animated on a TV show budget. And it's happening because of an expired coupon from years ago. Here's what makes the chicken fights genius. They're not parodies of action movies. They are action movies. The animation team choreographs these fights with genuine cinematic language. Camera angles, dramatic music, slow-motion impacts, environmental destruction that follows real physics, or at least cartoon physics that feel consistent. When Peter throws Ernie through a wall, you see the debris scatter in a way that feels weighty and real. When they crash through a glass ceiling, the shards reflect light. The show puts more production effort into these chicken fights than most animated shows put into their season finales. The escalation across the series tells its own story. That first fight was street level, a brawl between two guys. By the time you hit the internal affairs chicken fight, Peter and Ernie land on Stewie's time pad and fight their way across history. They're punching each other through different time periods. They end up in a genetic research lab. They end up in space. They crash back to Earth on an oil rig. They destroy the oil rig. This is no longer a fight about a coupon. This is two beings locked in an eternal conflict that transcends time, space, and rational explanation. They've become mythological figures, engaged in an endless cycle of violence, except one of them is a fat guy from Rhode Island, and the other is a chicken. The Fecal Matters episode added a whole new dimension to the rivalry. Peter's working as a volunteer nurse at the hospital, and Ernie shows up as his patient. Not to fight, he's actually dying, and the show plays this completely straight. Ernie is on his deathbed, and Peter refuses to help him because of their history. But then Lois convinces Peter that he needs the chicken in his life, that their rivalry is part of who Peter is. Peter keeps ignoring him until Ernie actually dies, and then Peter bursts in and gives him the most violent CPR imaginable, bringing him back to life. Peter admits that the chicken completes him. Their fight isn't just conflict, it's a relationship. It might be the most honest relationship Peter has outside of his family. Then there's the generational aspect. In The Chicken or the Meg, we learn that Ernie has a son named Nugget. Meg meets Nugget on a reality dating show, and they actually fall in love. So now the Griffin-Chicken conflict has a Romeo and Juliet dimension to it. Two families locked in a blood feud, and the children just want to be together. Peter refuses to accept Nugget despite seeing how well he treats Meg. But when Ernie orders Meg to renounce her father, Meg beats Ernie up and decapitates him, which is both horrifying and weirdly touching, because Meg chose her terrible father over a nice family that actually wanted her. That's the thing about the chicken fights that people don't talk about enough. They're funny because they're absurd, but they work because they mean something. Peter and Ernie's rivalry is about stubbornness. It's about two people who refuse to let go of a grievance long past the point where the grievance makes any sense. They fight because they've always fought. The original reason stopped mattering years ago, and the show acknowledges this explicitly. In one fight, they stop mid-battle and realise neither of them remembers what they're fighting about. They apologise, they go to dinner together, they have a lovely meal, and then the check comes and they both insist on paying, and the fight starts all over again. That's not just a comedy bit, that's a commentary on how conflict works between people. How many arguments in real life are still going because nobody can remember who started it? How many family feuds persist because the fighting itself has become the tradition? Peter and Ernie can't stop fighting because the fighting is what defines them. Without the rivalry, they're just two guys who once had a coupon dispute. With the rivalry, they're legendary. The choreography of these fights deserves special attention because it's genuinely impressive from an animation standpoint. The team at Family Guy treats chicken fights like prestige sequences. They storyboard them extensively. The timing of each hit, each crash, each environmental interaction is planned out with the same care that a live-action fight coordinator would use. There are moments in these fights that rival anything in superhero movies for sheer visual creativity. Peter using the environment as a weapon, Ernie countering with unexpected agility, both of them surviving impacts that would kill any normal being multiple times over. The death fake-outs at the end of each fight are their own running gag within the running gag. Peter wins, Ernie lies motionless, the camera lingers, the dramatic music plays, and then we hug at the close-up. One eye opens. He's alive, ready for next time. It's become so expected that it would actually be shocking if Ernie stayed dead. The audience anticipates the eye-opening moment, and the show knows the audience anticipates it, and it delivers it every time because the repetition is part of the joke. The chicken fights are about commitment. Commitment to the bit, commitment to the escalation, commitment to never letting a good rivalry die. Nobody in Quahog ever questions why there's a giant chicken walking around in a shirt and tie. Nobody questions why he and Peter fight. Nobody calls the police during these building-destroying, car-exploding, infrastructure-demolishing brawls. The town just accepts it as part of the landscape, the same way they accept that Stewie can talk or that Brian drives a car. The chicken exists because the show says he exists, and questioning it would ruin everything. Compare the chicken fights to the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote from old Looney Tunes. Both are endless rivalries. Both escalate in absurd ways. Both have a clear structure that repeats with variations. But the Coyote and the Roadrunner have defined roles. The Coyote always loses. The Roadrunner always escapes. Peter and Ernie don't have defined roles. Sometimes Peter wins. Sometimes Ernie wins. Sometimes they're evenly matched. The outcome is unpredictable, even though the structure is predictable, and that keeps the fights fresh, even after all these years. The fights also serve an important structural purpose in the show. They're palate cleansers. When an episode is dealing with something heavy, or when the B-plot needs a break, the show can throw in a chicken fight and instantly shift the tone. You're watching a story about Chris getting expelled from school, and suddenly Peter and a chicken are destroying a Ferris wheel. The tonal whiplash is the point. It reminds you that no matter how serious things get in Quahog, the show can and will veer into complete lunacy at any moment. The fact that the chicken fights have persisted across the entire run of the show, from the early seasons through the cancellation and revival, and all the way to the most recent episodes, means they've become a Family Guy institution. New viewers discover them and immediately understand what kind of show this is. Long-time viewers anticipate them and compare each new fight to the previous ones. They're a benchmark, a measuring stick. Every new chicken fight has to top the last one, and somehow the show keeps finding ways to do it. Ernie the giant chicken started as a throwaway joke about an expired coupon and became one of the most iconic recurring characters in animation history. He doesn't have deep dialogue. He doesn't have complex motivations. He doesn't have a backstory that explains why he's a giant chicken. He just shows up, fights Peter, and leaves. And that simplicity is exactly what makes him perfect. In a show that can be messy and overambitious, and sometimes too clever for its own good, the chicken fights are pure. They're just two guys hitting each other for no good reason, and the show treating that like it's the most important thing happening in the universe. There's also the question of what Ernie does when he's not fighting Peter. Because the show gives us glimpses of his life, and it turns out he's basically a normal suburban guy. He has a wife named Nicole. They go to restaurants. He apparently has a job, because he's always wearing that shirt and tie like he just came from the office. Ernie the giant chicken has a house, a marriage, a routine, and a social life. And then every few seasons, he bumps into Peter Griffin, and the two of them destroy millions of dollars worth of property in a fight that neither of them can explain. The show has hinted that their rivalry has financial consequences. In the episode where Peter saves Ernie's life at the hospital, Peter explicitly mentions that if Ernie died, Peter would be solely responsible for all the damages from their previous fights. The city of Quahog has apparently been keeping a running tab on the destruction caused by Peter and Ernie's battles, and the costs are being split between them, which raises the question of how either of them can afford it. Peter can barely keep his family financially afloat under normal circumstances. Adding the bill for multiple demolished buildings, crashed aircraft, and destroyed infrastructure would bankrupt anyone. Yet both Peter and Ernie continue to live normal suburban lives between fights, as if the property damage tab doesn't exist until someone brings it up. The sound design of the chicken fights is something that doesn't get enough credit. The punches land with genuine impact. The glass breaks with realistic, shattering sounds. The music swells and falls like a real action movie score. The sound team at Family Guy treats these sequences with the same respect they'd give to a tentpole blockbuster. And the result is fights that feel more visceral than they have any right to feel in an animated comedy. You wince when Peter hits the concrete. You feel the impact when Ernie gets thrown through a wall. The audio work sells the physicality of these encounters in a way that makes them genuinely exciting to watch, even after you've seen the same basic structure play out a dozen times. Some of the best chicken fight moments are the pauses. In the middle of the chaos, there are these brief moments where Peter and Ernie stop, catch their breath, and then resume with even more intensity. Those pauses are borrowed from classic Hong Kong action cinema, where the best fight choreographers understood that a brief stillness makes the next burst of action feel even more explosive. The fact that Family Guy's animation team understands and applies this principle shows how seriously they take the craft of these sequences, even though the sequences themselves are fundamentally ridiculous. The Star Wars parallels are worth noting too. In the Empire Strikes Back retelling, something dark side, Ernie plays Boba Fett. The galaxy's most feared bounty hunter, the guy who captures Han Solo, is played by Peter's chicken nemesis. This means their rivalry extends into the show's alternate storytelling as well. Even when the characters are dressed up as different people in a different universe, the antagonism between Peter and Ernie persists. It's built into the DNA of the show, transcending any individual episode or storyline. Wherever Peter goes, whatever role he's playing, the chicken is there, ready to throw down. The generational legacy of the chicken rivalry takes on extra weight when you consider that Family Guy itself has become a generational show. Kids who watched Peter fight the chicken in 2005 are now adults who watch Peter fight the chicken in 2025. The rivalry has literally outlasted marriages, careers, and presidencies. It's a constant in a world of variables. Politicians come and go, cultural trends rise and fall, but Peter Griffin and Ernie the giant chicken will always find a reason to destroy a building together. There's something almost comforting about that. In an unpredictable world, At least the chicken fight is reliable. But enough about physical fights, let's talk about psychological ones. Because the most interesting battle in Family Guy isn't happening on the streets of Quahog. It's happening inside the mind of a 1-year-old baby who might be the most complex character in all of animation. Stewie Griffin is, without exaggeration, one of the most psychologically complex characters ever created for television. Not just animated television, all of television. And the fact that he's a 1-year-old baby who can barely walk makes this even more remarkable, because the show uses his age as both a joke and a genuine emotional tool. Everything about Stewie is a contradiction. He's an infant with the vocabulary of a Cambridge professor. He builds technology that could reshape human civilization, and he stores it in a nursery next to his teddy bear. He plotted to kill his own mother for the better part of a decade, and then slowly evolved into someone who just wants to be loved. Stewie's journey across the entire run of Family Guy is secretly the most interesting story the show has ever told. And most people don't even realise it's happening because the show buries it under jokes about fart noises and celebrity impressions. In the beginning, Stewie was a straight-up villain. Season 1, Stewie had one goal, and that goal was world domination, with a side project of murdering Lois. He talked about killing his mother constantly. He built weapons. He had maps with strategic plans pinned to his bedroom wall. He spoke with this exaggerated British accent that made him sound like a tiny Rex Harrison from My Fair Lady, which is exactly where Seth MacFarlane got the voice from. Early Stewie was a cartoon supervillain in a diaper, and the joke was the contrast between his genocidal ambitions and the fact that he's a baby who still needs his mother to change him. That version of Stewie was hilarious, but it was also limited. You can only do so many episodes about a baby trying to kill his mum before the joke wears thin. So the show started evolving him, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The murder attempts became less frequent, the world domination schemes became more sporadic, and in their place, something much more interesting started to emerge. Stewie began developing actual relationships, actual fears, actual vulnerabilities that had nothing to do with his supervillain persona. The most important relationship in Stewie's life is with Brian. These two are the emotional backbone of the entire show, and their friendship is the one thing Family Guy takes completely seriously. The road to episodes where Stewie and Brian go on adventures together are consistently the most acclaimed episodes the show produces. They work because the dynamic between the two characters is genuine. Brian is a failed intellectual who desperately wants to be taken seriously. Stewie is a genius who desperately wants to be loved. They complete each other in a way that no other pairing on the show can match. The Brian and Stewie bottle episode is probably the best example of this. The entire episode takes place inside a bank vault where they're accidentally locked overnight. No cutaway gags, no B-plot, just Brian and Stewie talking. And what comes out is devastating. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box because he thinks about killing himself. Stewie, the former supervillain, the baby who plotted to murder his own mother, is genuinely terrified by this confession. He breaks down. He tells Brian that he's the only person in the world who makes him feel safe. That without Brian, he'd have nobody. Let that sink in for a second. The baby genius with a time machine, ray guns, and the ability to travel between dimensions is emotionally dependent on an alcoholic dog who can't finish a novel. That's not a joke. That's actual character writing. The show earned that moment by spending years building the relationship between these two, and when the emotional payoff came, it hit harder than anything in a show about fart jokes has any right to hit. Then came Send in Stewie, Please. This might be the single most important episode in understanding who Stewie actually is. The entire episode is Stewie sitting in a child psychologist's office, talking. That's it. No action, no cutaways, no Peter, just a therapy session. And over the course of the conversation, everything about Stewie gets deconstructed. The psychologist, Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, starts by noting that Stewie has strong opinions. Stewie, being Stewie, immediately analyses the Doctor's personal life in remarkable detail, demonstrating his intelligence as a defense mechanism. But then the Doctor does something nobody in Stewie's life has ever done. He sees through the persona. He tells Stewie that he's lonely, and Stewie cries, not dramatically, not for comedic effect. He just tears up because someone finally said the thing he's been hiding from himself for years. The conversation goes deeper. Stewie admits he was pushed down the stairs by another student and didn't fight back. He discusses his sexuality, claiming to be straight but with a complicated relationship to the question. He admits to pulling out his own hair from anxiety, a real condition called trichotillomania that the show depicts with surprising sensitivity. He talks about his abandoned world domination plans and his fascination with musicals. He has a genuine temper tantrum about not being on Broadway. And then the most important moment happens. Stewie drops the British accent. His real voice is just a normal American kid's voice. The accent, the persona, the genius supervillain identity, it's all a mask. It's a coping mechanism. Stewie created this elaborate version of himself because the real version felt too vulnerable, too ordinary, too likely to be hurt. The British accent isn't who he is, it's who he pretends to be, because being himself feels too dangerous. The Doctor sees all of this. And for a moment it seems like Stewie might actually let the mask down permanently. But then he reconsiders. Being normal means being like everyone else. Being like everyone else means being forgettable. And Stewie Griffin would rather be a lonely genius than a happy nobody. So he puts the accent back on and walks out of the room. But before he leaves, the Doctor starts having a heart attack, and Stewie lets him die because the Doctor saw through his facade. He later tells Brian that he's done something awful, but never explains what. That episode changed everything about how fans understood Stewie. He's not a genius baby who happens to be funny. He's a deeply lonely child who constructed an entire false identity to protect himself from the emotional pain of being different. His inventions, his accent, his attitude, they're all armor. And underneath the armor is just a scared kid who wants someone to see him for who he really is, but is terrified of what would happen if they did. The who can understand Stewie situation adds another layer of psychological complexity. In the early seasons, adults couldn't understand what Stewie was saying. He'd deliver elaborate monologues about world domination, and Lois would just smile and say something like, "Oh, someone's cranky." This was played for comedy, obviously, but it also created this profound isolation. Stewie was the smartest person in the room, and nobody could hear him. His genius was invisible to the people around him. Then gradually, without explanation, people started understanding him. Brian could always understand him. Then Chris could sometimes hear him. Then Peter started responding to things Stewie said. Eventually, everyone could understand him, and the show never addressed the change. There was no magic moment where Stewie's voice became audible to adults. It just happened over time. Some fans have theorized that the show is depicting Stewie growing up. In the early seasons, he was a true infant, and his speech was just baby babble that the audience could understand, but the characters couldn't. As he developed, his speech became real, and people could hear him. It's an interesting theory, but the show has never confirmed it. The ambiguity is the point. Like everything about Stewie, the question of whether people can hear him depends on what's funnier or more emotionally useful in any given moment. The time travel dimension of Stewie's character deserves its own discussion, which we'll get to later, but it's worth noting here how it connects to his psychology. Stewie built a time machine in his bedroom. He can travel anywhere in history. He can change the past, alter the future, visit alternate realities. This should make him the most powerful being in the universe. And yet he uses this godlike power mostly to fix personal problems or go on adventures with Brian. He doesn't conquer the world. He doesn't reshape history to his liking, at least not permanently. He uses the time machine the way a lonely kid would use a really impressive toy. It's something to do, something to distract him from the fact that he's a 1-year-old with the emotional burdens of a middle-aged philosopher. The twin Dave situation adds another dark layer. Stewie had a twin brother named Dave who died in the womb, which Stewie may or may not have caused. Then there's Bertram, his half-brother from when Peter donated sperm. Bertram hates Stewie and eventually tries to erase him from existence by going back in time to kill Leonardo da Vinci, who is apparently Stewie's ancestor. Stewie has to kill Bertram to save himself. So this baby has already dealt with the death of a twin, the existence of a rival half-sibling, and the experience of killing a family member in self-defense. And he's 1 year old. The show's exploration of Stewie's sexuality has been handled with unusual care for a comedy show. The early seasons heavily implied that Stewie was gay, using it mostly as a joke. He liked fashion, he liked musicals, he had feminine interests. But over time, the show started treating the question more seriously. In the therapy episode, Stewie describes his sexuality as complicated but claims heterosexuality. Other episodes show him attracted to women. Some episodes show him attracted to men. The show seems to be saying that Stewie is still figuring it out, which is actually a pretty progressive take for a show that started airing in 1999. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that Stewie is a character who is figuring out his identity in every possible way, not just sexually. And you can see this across the entire run of the show. Early Stewie knew exactly who he was, the evil genius baby, and had absolute confidence in that identity. Modern Stewie is less certain about everything. He's less evil, less confident, less defined. But he's also more real, more vulnerable, more emotionally accessible. The character evolved from a one-dimensional villain into a fully three-dimensional person, and it happened so gradually that you might not notice it unless you're watching the whole series in order. The relationship between Stewie and Lois is its own fascinating study. Stewie wanted to kill Lois for years. He built devices specifically designed to end her life. He fantasized about it openly, but he also needs her desperately. She's his mother. She feeds him, bathes him, puts him to bed. In one of the most telling running gags, Stewie constantly misses Lois when she's gone, even though he claims to hate her. The desire to kill her and the need to be nurtured by her exists simultaneously, and the show uses this tension to generate both comedy and genuine pathos. The simulation episodes where Stewie actually succeeds in killing Lois and taking over the world are revealing because they show what happens when Stewie gets everything he wants. He takes control of the planet, he rules from the White House, and he's miserable, not because the power isn't what he expected, but because without his family, without the dynamic that drives him, he's just alone with his intelligence and nothing to push against. Stewie needs the Griffins, the way the chicken fights need Peter and Ernie. The conflict is the point. Peter's relationship with Stewie is less explored, but equally interesting. Peter largely ignores Stewie, sometimes forgetting his name entirely, but in rare moments Peter shows genuine affection for his youngest son, and those moments seem to mean more to Stewie than any technological achievement or world domination scheme. When Peter pays attention to Stewie, even briefly, Stewie lights up. It's the simplest, most human desire imaginable, a child wanting his father's attention, expressed through the most complex, least human character on the show. Rupert, Stewie's teddy bear, is the final piece of the psychological puzzle. Stewie talks to Rupert constantly. He treats Rupert as a real person, with thoughts, feelings, and opinions. He gets jealous when other characters interact with Rupert. He goes to extreme lengths to protect and retrieve Rupert when he's lost or damaged. This would be normal baby behaviour except Stewie is also a genius who understands perfectly well that Rupert is a stuffed animal. He chooses to maintain the illusion because the emotional comfort of having a friend who never judges, never leaves, and never sees through his facade is worth more to him than intellectual honesty. Stewie Griffin started as a joke, a baby who talks like a British villain, and became one of the most nuanced explorations of loneliness, identity, and emotional defense mechanisms in television history. He's funny because he's absurd. He's compelling because he's real. And underneath the accent, the gadgets, the time machine, and the world domination plans, he's just a kid who wants someone to tell him he's okay exactly as he is. The show has been telling that story for over 20 years, and it might never actually resolve it, because some stories aren't meant to end. They're meant to be lived in. Speaking of characters who are living in their own emotional mess, let's talk about Brian. Because if Stewie hides behind genius, Brian hides behind something arguably worse: pretension. Brian Griffin is a dog. That's the fundamental thing about Brian that the show keeps reminding you of exactly when it hurts the most. He drives a car, he drinks martinis, he dates human women. He writes novels, he has political opinions and a college education, and a therapist and a deep, abiding belief that he is an intellectual. And then the show will have him eat garbage out of a trash can, or chase a tennis ball against his will, or get excited about a car ride, and the whole facade crumbles. Brian wants to be human more than anything in the world, and the universe keeps telling him he's not. The drinking is probably the most visible symptom. Brian is an alcoholic by any reasonable definition. He drinks constantly, martinis at the house, drinks at the Drunken Clam, wine with dinner, cocktails on dates. The alcohol consumption is played for comedy most of the time. But every now and then the show acknowledges that Brian's drinking isn't just a personality quirk. It's a coping mechanism for a creature that exists in a state of permanent identity crisis. He's too smart to be a pet and too much of a pet to be a person, and alcohol fills the gap between those two realities. In the thin white line, Brian becomes a drug-sniffing dog for the police and immediately gets addicted to cocaine. He goes to rehab. The show plays some of it for laughs, but the underlying point is serious. Brian is susceptible to addiction because he's constantly trying to medicate an existential wound that can't be healed with substances. He doesn't know what he is. He doesn't know where he belongs. And when you don't know those things, anything that temporarily stops the question from mattering feels like a solution. The writing career is Brian's most sustained attempt at proving he's more than a dog, and it's also his most sustained failure. Brian's novel Faster Than the Speed of Love is terrible. Not mediocre, not needs work. Terrible. Everyone who reads it hates it. The show takes genuine pleasure in humiliating Brian's literary ambitions. His book gets terrible reviews. His attempts at follow-up projects go nowhere. His screenwriting ambitions in Hollywood lead him to directing pornography, which is the show's way of saying that Brian's creative aspirations will always be redirected into something embarrassing. There's a cruelty to how the show treats Brian's writing that goes beyond normal comedy. Either characters fail at things too, but the show doesn't invest the same level of vindictive energy into their failures. With Brian, the message is consistent and harsh. You think you're a writer, but you're not. You think you have something to say, but you don't. You think your intelligence makes you special, but it doesn't. The show punishes Brian for his pretensions in a way that it doesn't punish Peter for his stupidity or Stewie for his megalomania. Brian's sin is wanting to be more than he is, and the show treats that ambition as the worst sin of all. The quagmire speech from Jerome is the new black is the most devastating takedown Brian has ever received, and it comes from the last person you'd expect to deliver moral judgment. Quagmire, the serial predator, the man with the most questionable ethics in Quahog, sits Brian down and tells him exactly what's wrong with him. You're a fake intellectual. You're a failed writer. You mooch off the Griffin family. You're in love with your best friend's wife. You pretend to care about liberal causes, but your actual behaviour doesn't reflect any of those values. Everything about you is performance. The speech works because it's true. Every single thing Quagmire says is backed up by evidence from the show itself. Brian does mooch off Peter. Brian does fail at writing. Brian does love Lois, which is established all the way back in the early episode Brian in Love, where he starts having bathroom accidents because he's in love with Lois and the stress is manifesting physically. Brian has spent the entire series pretending to be something he's not, and Quagmire, of all people, is the one who calls him out on it. And the really painful part is that Brian can't argue with any of it. He doesn't have a defence. He just sits there and takes it, because deep down he knows Quagmire is right. Brian's self-image doesn't match reality, and he's aware of the gap even if he's usually too proud to admit it. The Quagmire speech doesn't change Brian. He doesn't reform. He doesn't become more honest or less pretentious. He just goes back to being Brian, which tells you that Brian's pretensions aren't a choice he can change. They're the only thing keeping him functional. Take away Brian's belief that he's an intellectual, and what's left? A dog with a drinking problem. Brian's love life is a train wreck that reveals the same pattern over and over again. He dates human women. It never works out. He's attracted to women who are either too smart for him, in which case his intellectual insecurities get triggered, or not smart enough for him, in which case he gets bored and behaves badly. He dated Gillian, a beautiful but profoundly stupid woman, and treated the relationship with a mixture of condescension and insecurity. He's been rejected by Lois repeatedly. He's been used, dumped and humiliated by various women across the series. And through all of it, the fundamental problem is always the same. Brian is a dog trying to have human relationships, and no matter how many martinis he drinks or novels he writes, that basic biological reality keeps asserting itself. The show uses Brian's species as a metaphor for imposter syndrome in a way that's honestly more insightful than it has any right to be. Brian is someone who has convinced himself that he belongs in a world that wasn't made for him, and he's constantly performing competence in areas where he fundamentally doesn't belong. He name drops authors he may not have actually read. He references political theory he might not fully understand. He acts cultured and sophisticated in situations where he's actually out of his depth. Sound familiar? This is what imposter syndrome feels like. You're performing a version of yourself that you're not sure is real, and every moment of every day carries the risk that someone will look at you and say, "Wait, you're not actually one of us." Brian's death in Life of Brian and subsequent resurrection in Christmas Guy is interesting from this perspective too. When Brian dies, the show briefly replaces him with Vinny, a Brooklyn-accented Italian dog who is everything Brian isn't. Vinny is comfortable in his own skin. Vinny doesn't pretend to be anything he's not. Vinny is just a regular dog who happens to talk, and he's perfectly fine with that. The contrast with Brian is almost cruel. Here's what a talking dog looks like when he's not constantly performing human sophistication. He's actually happier than Brian ever was. But Vinny couldn't last because the show needs Brian's tension. A well-adjusted dog isn't interesting. A dog in perpetual existential crisis is a goldmine of comedy and pathos. Brian's unhappiness is essential to the show's DNA. He has to keep failing and pretending and drinking and striving because that cycle of aspiration and failure is what makes him dramatically compelling. A happy Brian would be a boring Brian, and the show seems to understand this intuitively. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian, and he's said in interviews that Brian is the character closest to his own personality. That's either very honest or very concerning, depending on how you look at it. MacFarlane is a successful writer, singer, and producer who has achieved more than most people ever will. Brian is a failed writer who can't finish a novel and directs porn in Hollywood. The gap between the creator and the creation suggests that Brian might represent MacFarlane's worst fears about himself, rather than his actual reality. Brian is what happens when talent gets swallowed by insecurity and self-medication. He's a cautionary tale wearing a collar. The thing that saves Brian, the thing that keeps him from being completely pathetic, is his relationship with Stewie. As we talked about earlier, Stewie is the one person who sees Brian clearly and loves him anyway. Not because of the intellectual performance, not because of the writing, not because of the political opinions, but because of who Brian actually is underneath all of that. A loyal, caring, deeply insecure creature who needs a friend more than he needs a literary agent. In the bank vault, when Brian admits to keeping a gun for suicide, it's Stewie who doesn't judge him. It's Stewie who says, "I'm not going anywhere." The most emotionally honest moment of Brian's life happens not with a romantic partner, or a publisher, or a drinking buddy, but with a baby who is also his best friend. That's the tragedy and the beauty of Brian's situation. The acceptance he's been looking for his whole life was right next to him the entire time, in the form of a football-headed baby genius who also happens to be the only person in the world who thinks Brian is worth something exactly as he is. Brian could find happiness if he stopped performing. That's the show's quiet, persistent message about him. Every time Brian drops the act and just exists as himself, things go better. His best moments are when he's being genuine with Stewie, or helping the family, or doing something kind without any ulterior motive. His worst moments are when he's trying to impress people, or prove something, or live up to an image that he created and can't maintain. Brian's pretensions aren't making him happy. They never have. But he can't stop because stopping would mean accepting that he's just a dog. And that's the one thing Brian has spent his entire existence refusing to believe. The Life of Brian death arc is probably the most significant Brian storyline in the entire series, and it's significant for what it says about both the character and the audience. The show actually killed Brian, hit him with a car, put him in the vet's office, had the family say goodbye, had him die on screen, and then the show moved on. They replaced him with a new dog named Vinny, a rough around the edges Italian guy who seemed perfectly nice, but wasn't Brian. The fan reaction was volcanic. People were furious, not mildly disappointed, furious. Petitions were created demanding Brian's return. Social media exploded with anger, grief, and accusations that the show had made a terrible mistake. The intensity of the response told you something important about Brian's place in the show and in the hearts of the audience. People genuinely mourned a fictional cartoon dog. They felt betrayed by the writers. They felt like something real had been taken from them. The show brought Brian back a few episodes later via time travel. Stewie found a way to rebuild the time machine and go back to prevent Brian's death. Everything reset. Brian was alive, Vinny was gone. The status quo was restored. And the whole experience left a strange residue over the show. Brian's death proved that Family Guy could genuinely shock its audience. Brian's resurrection proved that the show would never let that shock last long enough to fundamentally change anything. But those few episodes without Brian were genuinely different. The dynamic was off. Vinny was fine as a character, but the specific chemistry between Brian and Stewie, between Brian and Peter, between Brian and the rest of the family was irreplaceable. You didn't realise how much Brian contributed to the show's emotional ecosystem until he was gone. He was the moral centre, however flawed. He was the character who would call out bad behaviour, even if his own behaviour was just as bad. Without him, the family felt untethered, like they'd lost their gravity and were floating away from each other. The alcoholism thread in Brian's character is one of the show's most consistent elements. Brian drinks in almost every episode. He's been to rehab. He's been confronted about his drinking. He's admitted to being unable to go a day without alcohol. The show mostly plays this for comedy, but the underlying pattern is clear. Brian self-medicates because his life doesn't match his expectations. He expected to be a famous writer, a respected intellectual, a sophisticated person living a sophisticated life. Instead, he's a house pet who can't finish a novel and can't maintain a relationship. Alcohol bridges the gap between who Brian thinks he is and who Brian actually is, and that bridge gets wider every year. He's Squidward with a martini glass. He thinks he's too good for his life, but his life might actually be too good for him. And he can't see it because he's too busy looking for something better that doesn't exist. And if Brian represents what happens when you can't accept yourself, then there's another Griffin family member who represents what happens when nobody accepts you at all. Meg Griffin's story is the darkest running joke in television history, and it stopped being a joke a long time ago. But before we get to that, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the craziest lore in animated television, hit that subscribe button. It actually really helps with getting these videos to more people. Alright, back to the family. Meg Griffin is the most consistently mistreated character in the history of American animated television. That's not an exaggeration. There are characters who have been killed, tortured, humiliated, and abused across various shows, but no character has endured the kind of sustained, systematic, emotional destruction that Meg experiences on a weekly basis from her own family. Peter forgets she exists. Lois barely acknowledges her. Chris actively mocks her. Stewie treats her with open contempt. Brian, the supposed moral compass of the family, barely registers her as a person. The citizens of Quahog treat her like a contagion. And the show itself seems to take a particular pleasure in making Meg's life as miserable as possible. It started small. In the early seasons, Meg was just the awkward teenage daughter who couldn't catch a break. She had bad luck with boys. She wasn't popular at school. She made embarrassing choices, normal teenage sitcom stuff. The jokes about Meg weren't significantly meaner than the jokes about any other character. She was part of the ensemble, just the least important part. But somewhere around seasons 4 and 5, something shifted. The show discovered that making Meg miserable was funny, and it leaned into that discovery with an intensity that went from uncomfortable to concerning to genuinely dark. The voice actress change might have something to do with it. Lacey Chabot voiced Meg in season 1. Mila Kunis took over starting in season 2. There's never been a definitive public explanation for exactly why the change happened, but the shift in how the character was written roughly correlates with the transition. Kunis brought a different energy to Meg, one that was slightly more deadpan, slightly more resigned, slightly more able to absorb punishment without breaking. And the writers, whether consciously or not, started giving her more punishment to absorb. Peter's treatment of Meg is probably the most egregious. This is her father. This is the man who is supposed to protect and support her, and he regularly forgets she's his daughter. He excludes her from family activities. He speaks to her with a level of casual cruelty that goes beyond comedy and into something that feels genuinely abusive. In multiple episodes, Peter physically harms Meg, and the show treats it as slapstick. He's thrown things at her. He's pushed her. He's forgotten her name, her age, her interests, and her existence. The show has a recurring bit where someone asks Peter how many kids he has, and he says 2, completely omitting Meg. Lois is almost worse because she's supposed to be the responsible parent. Peter's cruelty toward Meg can be partially attributed to his stupidity. He's not smart enough to understand the impact of his behaviour. But Lois is smart, Lois is aware, and Lois still participates in the family's collective dismissal of Meg. She criticises Meg's appearance. She undermines Meg's self-esteem. She's not as overtly cruel as Peter, but her quieter, more passive neglect might actually be more damaging because it comes from a parent who is capable of doing better and chooses not to. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode from season 10 is where the show went from dark comedy to something that felt genuinely disturbing in its implications. The episode puts the family in the house during a hurricane, and Meg finally snaps. She's had enough. Years of abuse, years of being the punching bag, years of being treated like she doesn't matter, and she lets everyone have it. She tears into each family member with surgical precision, calling out their specific failures and cruelties. And here's the thing, she's right about all of it. Everything she says is accurate. The family deserves every word. But here's what happens next, and this is where the episode gets genuinely troubling. Without Meg absorbing the family's dysfunction, the family falls apart. Peter and Lois start fighting. Chris spirals. The family unit can't function without someone at the bottom of the hierarchy taking the abuse. The dysfunction needs a target, and without Meg in that role, it turns inward and destroys everything. Brian, of all people, is the one who talks to Meg about this. He tells her, essentially, that her role as the family's punching bag is important. That by absorbing their negativity, she's keeping the family together. That she should go back to accepting the abuse because the alternative is the family destroying itself. And Meg does it. She goes back to the family, apologises for speaking up, and resumes her position at the bottom. The episode's message, whether intended or not, is that some people exist to be mistreated so that dysfunctional systems can continue functioning. That's not a joke. That's a thesis about how families, and by extension societies, create scapegoats. And the show delivered it through the character who's been its scapegoat for over 2 decades. I've thought about that episode a lot, and I'm still not sure how to feel about it. On one level, it's honest. Real families do create scapegoats. Real groups do need someone at the bottom of the hierarchy to absorb collective anxiety and aggression. That's a documented psychological phenomenon. The show is reflecting a genuine truth about how human beings organize themselves in groups. But on another level, the episode seems to be justifying the abuse by presenting it as necessary. Meg should go back to being mistreated because the alternative is worse. That's a message that tells real people in real abusive situations that their suffering has a purpose and they should accept it. That's not comedy, that's ideology. The darker Meg episodes go even further. Over the seasons, Meg has exhibited behaviours that, if you look at them from a clinical perspective, rather than a comedic one, are clearly trauma responses. She's desperate for romantic attention to the point of stalking and kidnapping. She's cut herself. She's shown signs of severe depression. She's exhibited obsessive and compulsive behaviours. She's formed unhealthy attachments to people who show her even the slightest kindness. All of this makes perfect sense if you view Meg as someone who has been emotionally abused her entire life and has developed maladaptive coping mechanisms as a result. The show treats these behaviours as punchlines. Meg is creepy, Meg is desperate, Meg is weird, but remove the laugh track and what you have is a portrait of a young woman who has been systematically denied love, acceptance, and basic human dignity by the people who are supposed to provide it, and who has responded to that denial by developing the exact kinds of psychological problems that real abuse victims develop. The show accidentally created one of the most realistic depictions of the long-term effects of emotional abuse in animated television. It just doesn't realise it because it's too busy using those effects as jokes. There are episodes where Meg gets brief moments of happiness and they're almost always ripped away. She'll find a boyfriend and he'll turn out to be using her or will be driven away by the family. She'll achieve something at school and nobody will notice or care. She'll have a moment of genuine connection with another person and it'll be undercut by the next episode's return to the status quo of mistreatment. The show gives Meg hope the way a cat gives a mouse room to run. The hope isn't real, it's just set up for the next humiliation. The Amish episode is a perfect example. Meg meets Eli, an Amish boy, and they fall in love. It's genuine, it's sweet. Meg is happy in a way that she almost never gets to be. And then the family drags her away from it, not because of any legitimate concern for her well-being, but because the show can't allow Meg to have something good for for more than one episode. The status quo requires Meg to be miserable, and any deviation from that misery is temporary by definition. Even the physical comedy directed at Meg has a different quality than the physical comedy directed at other characters. When Peter gets hurt, it's slapstick. When Meg gets hurt, it's often played as something she deserves or something nobody cares about. In the episode about Chris joining the Peace Corps, the family escapes on a seaplane, but forgets Meg, who is left face down in the river riddled with darts and arrows. The visual is horrifying if you take it at face value. A teenage girl left for dead by her own family, but the show plays it as a quick gag and moves on. Meg's suffering isn't important enough to dwell on. It's just background noise. What really strikes me about Meg's situation is how it interacts with the show's fourth wall awareness. Family Guy knows it mistreats Meg. The writers know. The characters occasionally reference it directly. But the awareness doesn't lead to change. It leads to more jokes about the awareness. The show is trapped in a loop where acknowledging the cruelty doesn't stop the cruelty. It just adds another layer to it. Meta-commentary about Meg's suffering becomes another form of Meg's suffering. Even the show's self-awareness is weaponized against her. Every family needs someone to blame. Every group needs someone at the bottom. Every system needs a pressure valve. Meg is all of those things for the Griffin family. She absorbs the dysfunction so the other characters can continue being dysfunctional without consequences. She's the foundation that the whole structure rests on. And like most foundations, nobody looks at her or thinks about her or appreciates that she's holding everything up. They just pile more weight on top and assume she'll hold. The voice actress change tells its own story about how the show perceived Meg from the beginning. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg in the first season, and then Mila Kunis took over from season 2 onwards. The transition wasn't dramatic. Kunis adjusted to the role quickly, and most viewers didn't notice or care about the switch. But the fact that the show replaced its original Meg without fanfare is almost too on brand. Even behind the scenes, the character of Meg is replaceable. She's the family member whose voice can change, and nobody bats an eye. Try recasting Peter or Stewie mid-series, and the audience would riot. Meg gets recast between seasons, and it barely registers. The cruelty toward Meg escalated significantly as the show progressed. In the early seasons, Meg was unpopular and awkward, but the abuse was relatively mild. She couldn't get dates. She was embarrassed by her family. She was a normal teenage girl dealing with normal teenage problems, amplified for comedy. But as the series continued, the writers seemed to discover that the audience laughed harder when the abuse got worse. So it got worse, and worse, and worse, until Meg became the target of cruelty so extreme that it circled back around, from comedy into something genuinely disturbing. Peter has physically assaulted Meg multiple times. He's fired her from a cannon. He's used her as a shield. He's forgotten her name, her age, her existence. There are episodes where Peter treats Meg with a level of contempt that would constitute abuse in any real-world context, and the show presents it as a punchline. Lois isn't much better. She openly mocks Meg's appearance, undermines her confidence, and in several episodes actively competes with her in ways designed to make Meg feel inferior. Even Chris, who you'd think would be a natural ally as a fellow teenage sibling, regularly treats Meg with disdain. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode is the one that made fans genuinely uncomfortable, and not in the way the show intended. A hurricane traps the family in the house, and Meg finally snaps. She tells each family member exactly what she thinks of them, dismantling their self-image with surgical precision. Peter is a terrible father. Lois is a narcissist. Chris is a follower. She tears the family apart with words alone, and they completely fall to pieces. Without Meg absorbing their dysfunction, the Griffins can't function. They turn on each other. The family structure collapses. And then Brian, of all people, convinces Meg that she needs to go back to being the punching bag. He tells her that her role in the family is to absorb the abuse so that everyone else can function, that without a scapegoat, the family will destroy itself. And Meg accepts this. She goes back to being the target. She puts the mask back on. She resumes her position as the family's designated victim because someone has to do it and nobody else will. The fan reaction to this episode was intense and mostly negative. People were genuinely angry, not because the writing was bad, but because the message seemed intentional. The show appeared to be arguing that some people exist to be mistreated, that their suffering serves a necessary function in maintaining a social system, and that they should accept this role willingly. Whether the writers intended this as dark comedy or genuine commentary, the result was an episode that left a lot of viewers feeling sick. The darker moments in Meg's storyline go beyond family abuse. The show has depicted Meg engaging in self-harm. She's been shown cutting herself in at least one episode. She's developed obsessive, unhealthy attachments to people who show her the slightest kindness. She's kidnapped Chris's girlfriend out of desperation for a friend. She's been depicted as so starved for affection that she'll accept attention from literally anyone, regardless of how inappropriate or dangerous the situation is. These aren't joke behaviours. These are trauma responses. They're the behavioural consequences of growing up in a household where you're constantly told you're worthless. What makes this especially complicated is that the show sometimes acknowledges how dark the Meg situation is, and then immediately returns to the status quo. There are episodes where characters express genuine concern for Meg, where the emotional toll of her treatment is briefly taken seriously, and then the next episode resets everything, and Peter is making fat jokes at her expense again. The show knows what it's doing to Meg. It just doesn't care enough to stop. The real-world parallel is uncomfortable because it's accurate. Every family, every workplace, every social group has the potential to create a Meg, someone who becomes the default target for everyone else's frustrations, someone whose boundaries get eroded so gradually that nobody notices, least of all, the victim, someone who stays because leaving feels worse than enduring. Meg Griffin is a cartoon character, but the dynamic she represents is one of the most common and most destructive patterns in human social behaviour. The show is using exaggeration to depict something real, and the exaggeration is what lets people laugh at it instead of recognising it. The saddest thing about Meg isn't the abuse, it's that she keeps trying. After everything the family has done to her, after every humiliation and every forgotten birthday and every casual cruelty, Meg still wants to be loved by these people. She still comes home. She still sits at the dinner table. She still tries to participate in family activities. She hasn't given up on them, even though they gave up on her a long time ago. That persistence in the face of consistent rejection is either the most admirable or the most heartbreaking thing about Meg. And the show seems to think it's funny. It's not funny, but it might be true, and maybe that's enough. Alright, let's shift gears into something that'll really melt your brain, because we need to talk about the time machine. Not just that Stewie built one, which we already covered. We need to talk about the complete timeline of every time the time machine has been used, destroyed, rebuilt and used again, and I promise you, it makes less sense than you think. And also more sense, somehow both. Stewie Griffin built a time machine in his bedroom, and nobody in his family cared enough to ask about it. That's the starting point for one of the most surprisingly detailed science fiction mythologies in any animated comedy. A baby built a device that allows travel through the fourth dimension, powered it with plutonium he bought from a guy at a market, and kept it in his room alongside his toys and his teddy bear Rupert. And somehow, over the course of dozens of episodes, the show built a set of rules and a timeline around this device that is more internally consistent than it has any right to be. The time machine first becomes a major plot element in Road to Germany, where Mort Goldman desperately needs a bathroom, sees what he thinks is a portable toilet in Stewie's room, and accidentally transports himself to Warsaw, Poland on September 1st, 1939. The day of the Nazi invasion, Mort, a Jewish man, has just transported himself to the single worst place and time in history for a Jewish person to be. The comedy writes itself, except the show also plays the danger completely straight. Mort is genuinely in mortal peril. Stewie and Brian have to go back and rescue him before the Nazis find him. The rescue mission takes them across occupied Europe. They escape on a motorbike. There's an undersea pursuit in a stolen submarine. They reach England, where Stewie discovers the return pad, which is the portable device that brings them back to the present, is out of uranium fuel. The only place to get more uranium in 1939 is a secret nuclear testing facility in Nazi Germany. So Stewie disguises himself as Hitler. A baby disguises himself as Adolf Hitler to obtain uranium from a Nazi weapons program, so he can power a time travel device to rescue a Jewish pharmacist from the Holocaust. If you had pitched this plot to any network executive without the context of Family Guy, they would have had you escorted from the building. But the show commits. They join the Royal Air Force. They participate in a dogfight against the Luftwaffe. Stewie, still dressed as Hitler, obtains the uranium. They run into the actual Hitler, who orders their execution. They escape on the return pad just in time. And then Stewie does something genuinely clever. They arrive back in Stewie's room 30 seconds before Mort originally entered the time machine. To prevent a paradox, Stewie kills the Mort who travelled with them by shoving him into the time machine and blowing it up. The original Mort then enters the room, and finding no time machine, simply soils himself instead. The timeline is preserved. It's messy, violent, and logically sound. The return pad system is worth explaining because it's the backbone of the time travel mechanics. The time machine itself is stationary. It's a big device in Stewie's room. But the return pad is portable. It's what allows the traveller to get back to the present from wherever they end up. Without the return pad, you're stranded in whatever time period you've travelled to. This two-part system creates natural stakes in every time travel episode. The time machine gets you there. The return pad gets you back. Lose the pad and you're stuck. Break the pad and you need to find another way home. The system is simple enough to understand instantly and complex enough to generate genuine tension. Back to the pilot. From season 10 might be the most mind-bending time travel episode the show ever produced. Brian finds an old tennis ball and wishes he could locate another one he buried 10 years earlier. Stewie offers to take him back in time to note its location. Simple enough. But they travel back to January 31st, 1999, which is the date the very first episode of Family Guy aired. They literally visit the pilot episode of their own show. The animation changes when they arrive. Everything looks like the original season 1 art style. The characters are drawn differently. The proportions are off. Peter looks slightly different. The whole visual language of the show shifts to match what Family Guy looked like in 1999. This is the show commenting on its own evolution in the most literal way possible. They're standing inside the first episode, looking at themselves, and everything looks weird because the show has changed so much over the years. Stewie even points out that the old animation style looks strange. And then Brian makes a catastrophic mistake. He tells his past self about 9/11. His idea is that by warning himself in the past, the September 11th attacks can be prevented. And they are. Past Brian manages to prevent 9/11. The towers don't fall. Thousands of lives are saved. Brian and Stewie return to the present, expecting to find a better world. Instead, they find an apocalyptic wasteland. Without 9/11, the chain of events that followed in real history never happened. George W. Bush lost the 2004 election because there was no war on terror to campaign on. Bush, in the alternate timeline, creates a second Confederacy. This starts a second Civil War. America tears itself apart. The present is a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Preventing 9/11 didn't make the world better. It made the world catastrophically worse. Brian and Stewie go back again to stop the intervention. But now there are multiple versions of them running around in the past. Brian from the first trip, Brian from the second trip, Stewie from both trips, plus additional versions from other timelines that got created by the interference. At one point, there are roughly 50 different Brians and Stewies arguing with each other about what to do. They take a vote. The majority votes not to prevent 9/11. Peter votes twice. Eventually, the original Stewie forces everyone back to their own timelines at gunpoint, and the show resets to normal. That episode does something remarkable. It takes a real historical tragedy and uses it as the basis for a genuine philosophical thought experiment. Would preventing 9/11 actually make the world better? The show's answer is no. Not because 9/11 was good, but because history is a web of causation so complex that removing one event, even a terrible one, creates ripple effects that are impossible to predict. It's chaos theory applied to American history, delivered through a cartoon about a talking baby and his talking dog. The Hugh Illimuff episode from season 11 takes the time machine in a completely different direction. Brian has been secretly using Stewie's time machine to impress women at bars, which is such a perfectly Brian thing to do. He's been taking women on dates in different time periods to seem cool and worldly. To cover his tracks, he tries to roll back the trip counter on the machine, and in doing so, he breaks it. The machine explodes, and time starts flowing backwards. Everything in Quahog starts happening in reverse. People walk backwards. Conversations play backwards. The flow of cause and effect inverts. The Ipecac scene from an earlier episode plays in reverse, which means instead of characters vomiting, they're drinking vomit back in. That's one of those details that's simultaneously disgusting and genuinely clever, because the show is using the time reversal mechanic to comment on its own history. Every episode that ever happened is now technically happening unhappening. As time accelerates backwards, Stewie starts de-aging. He's getting younger, which means he's approaching the moment of his own birth. If time keeps going backwards, he'll be unborn. He'll cease to exist. Stewie has to rebuild the time machine while losing motor skills, losing the ability to walk, losing his vocabulary, basically regressing through infant development in reverse while trying to do physics. Brian has to finish the repair because Stewie becomes too young to function. Brian manages to reverse the reversal just as Stewie is about to be unborn, and time snaps back to normal. What I love about this episode is the stakes. The show found a way to make time travel personally threatening to Stewie in a way that previous episodes hadn't. It's not just that history might change, it's that Stewie himself might be erased. The time machine that he built, that represents his genius and his capabilities, nearly becomes the instrument of his own destruction because his best friend couldn't resist using it to pick up women. There's a poetic cruelty to that which the show handles perfectly. The Life of Brian and Christmas Guy episodes, which we covered in the Stewie section, are also crucial to the time machine lore. Stewie destroys the time machine because he and Brian have had too many close calls. This directly leads to Brian's death, because without the time machine, Stewie can't go back and prevent the car accident. The destruction of the machine has real consequences. It's not just a plot device that gets conveniently forgotten. Stewie made a choice to destroy it, and that choice cost Brian his life. The rebuilding is equally significant. In Christmas Guy, Stewie spots his past self at a mall buying a toy. The past Stewie still has his return pad because the time machine hasn't been destroyed yet in that timeline. Current Stewie steals the return pad from his past self and uses it to travel back to the moment before Brian's death. He pushes Brian out of the way of the car. Timeline resets, Brian lives, but the return pad came from a version of the timeline that no longer exists, which means Stewie essentially stole technology from a reality that he then erased. The logical implications of this are genuinely headache-inducing if you think about them too hard, which is probably why the show doesn't think about them at all. The Big Bang Theory episode already mentioned in the Stewie section, establishes perhaps the most important piece of time machine lore. Stewie and Brian get into a fight over the machine and accidentally launch themselves outside the space-time continuum. Stewie overloads his return pad, causing an explosion that sends them back to the future. Later, research reveals that this explosion was the Big Bang. Stewie's time machine caused the creation of the universe. This creates a temporal causality loop. The universe exists because Stewie's time machine exploded, but Stewie's time machine only exists because Stewie exists, and Stewie only exists because the universe exists. Each element depends on the other for its existence. There is no first event. The cause is the effect and the effect is the cause. Stewie built a time machine in a universe that only exists because he built a time machine. It's a perfect closed loop with no beginning and no end, which is either the most brilliant or most frustrating piece of fictional time travel logic ever written. Bertram, Stewie's half-brother, tries to break this loop by going back in time to kill Leonardo da Vinci, who is Stewie's ancestor. If da Vinci dies before having children, the bloodline that eventually produces Stewie never exists, which means the time machine never gets built, which means the Big Bang never happens, which means the universe itself ceases to exist. Bertram is essentially trying to destroy all of reality as a byproduct of eliminating his rival. Stewie has to travel to Renaissance Italy to save da Vinci, and by extension, the entire universe. He defeats Bertram. Da Vinci survives. The causal loop holds. Reality continues to exist because a baby won a fight against his half-brother in 15th century Venice. When you step back and look at the complete time machine lore, what's striking is how much internal consistency the show maintains despite not being a science fiction show. The rules are mostly followed. The return pad system creates natural stakes. The paradoxes are acknowledged rather than ignored. Characters face real consequences for time travel, including death, de-aging, and the accidental creation of the universe. For a show that routinely ignores its own continuity, the Time Machine episodes take their mythology surprisingly seriously. The Time Machine is also, on a character level, the most important thing Stewie has ever created, more than the weapons, more than the mind control devices. The Time Machine is what enables his most meaningful experiences. His greatest adventure was saving Brian across time. His greatest moment of vulnerability was losing Brian because he destroyed the time machine. His greatest scientific achievement was accidentally creating the universe. Everything significant in Stewie's life connects back to this one device, which he keeps in his bedroom, which nobody in his family ever questions, which runs on uranium that he buys from a guy who also sells to terrorists. Family Guy's time travel lore is insane, but it's insane in a way that makes perfect sense if you accept the premise. And the premise is simply that a genius baby built a time machine. Everything else follows logically from there. But the time machine only lets you move forward and backward. What about moving sideways? Because that's where things get really weird. Let's talk about the multiverse. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is frequently cited as the single best episode of Family Guy ever made. Not one of the best. The best. It won a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, and it earned that award by doing something that no animated comedy had done quite as well before or since. It took the concept of infinite parallel universes and used it to ask genuinely interesting questions about identity, free will, and the nature of reality, all while being consistently hilarious. The episode starts with a distinction that's important to the show's lore. The time machine moves you forward and backward through time. The multiverse remote, a separate device that Stewie also built, moves you sideways through parallel realities. These are different tools for different kinds of travel. Time travel changes when you are. The multiverse remote changes where you are, or more accurately, which version of reality you're currently in. Stewie explains this to Brian at the start of the episode, and the show sticks to this distinction throughout. The time machine and the multiverse remote are not the same thing. They operate on different principles. This matters because it means Family Guy has two distinct science fiction frameworks, and they've kept them separate and internally consistent. The first universe they visit is one where Christianity never existed, and what they find is genuinely thought-provoking. Without Christianity, the Dark Ages never happened. Without the centuries of intellectual suppression that came with medieval European Christianity, human civilization advanced at a dramatically faster rate. The universe where Christianity never took hold is roughly 1,000 years ahead technologically. Flying cars, advanced medicine, gleaming cities, it's a paradise. The implication is not subtle. The show is saying that organized religion, specifically Christianity, held human progress back by a millennium. You can agree or disagree with that premise, but the show commits to it with enough visual detail and logical consistency that it works as a thought experiment, regardless of your personal beliefs. Then they visit the Disney universe. This one is pure comedy. Everything is animated in the Disney style. Characters burst into song. Woodland creatures appear to help with daily tasks. The colours are brighter, the lines are cleaner, and then the show reveals the dark underside of the Disney aesthetic by showing what a reality governed by Disney logic would actually mean for the characters. It's a commentary on corporate sanitization of reality, delivered through a musical number. The Disney universe is beautiful and terrifying, which is probably how Disney would want it. There's an Ice Age universe, a universe where everything is poorly drawn. A robot chicken universe, which is a direct reference to the show that Family Guy has had an ongoing rivalry with. There's a Japanese anime universe, where the characters are redesigned in anime style, with exaggerated eyes and dramatic reactions. Each universe is a self-contained joke that also functions as a commentary on animation styles, cultural aesthetics, and the way different media frameworks shape how stories get told. The multiverse episode is essentially a crash course in animation history, disguised as a comedy plot. But the universe that matters most, the one that drives the episode's emotional core, is the dog universe. In this reality, dogs are the dominant species, and humans are the pets. Brian and Stewie arrive, and Brian immediately falls in love with it. In this universe, Brian isn't a pet. He isn't second class. He isn't a dog trying to pass as human. He's just a person, living in a society that was built for people like him. For the first time in his life, Brian belongs. He doesn't want to leave. He wants to stay in the dog universe forever. And he acts on that desire by breaking the multiverse remote, which is the only way for him and Stewie to get home. Brian deliberately strands them in a universe where he's comfortable, without considering what that means for Stewie. It's selfish in a way that's completely consistent with Brian's character. When given the choice between going home to a world where he doesn't quite fit and staying in a world where he does, Brian chooses himself. But the dog universe has a dark side. In this reality, the human version of Brian, a human man who is treated as a pet, is the equivalent of what Brian is in the normal universe. Human Brian walks on all fours. Human Brian gets walked on a leash. Human Brian is treated as an animal, because in this universe, humans are animals. The show holds up a mirror to Brian's own existence and forces him to see it from the other side. You think your life is bad? Look at what it means when the roles are reversed. This is what being a pet actually looks like. Things get worse when Stewie is sent to the pound. In the dog universe, a pound is where unwanted humans get euthanized. Stewie, a baby, is scheduled for lethal injection. The urgency is real. Stewie is genuinely going to die if Brian doesn't fix the remote and get them out of this universe. Brian, who broke the remote to stay in his paradise, now has to figure out how to fix it to save his best friend from being executed. His selfishness almost kills Stewie, which is one of those moments where the show takes a comedic premise and twists it into genuine stakes. They escape, obviously. Brian and Stewie make it back to their own universe, but the experience changes Brian, at least temporarily. He saw a world where he could be happy, and he also saw what his happiness would cost. The Dog Universe episode is ultimately about the fantasy of belonging somewhere else, and the reality that belonging always comes with trade-offs. Brian could fit in perfectly in the Dog Universe, but only if he accepts that someone else has to be in the position he just escaped. Freedom for one means captivity for another. The multiverse doesn't offer solutions, it just reframes the problem. There's a small detail at the end that really sticks with me. When Brian and Stewie return to their own universe, a human Brian from the Dog Universe, the one who realised that a better life might exist in a different reality, jumps through the portal at the last second. Human Brian lands in the regular Family Guy universe full of hope. He's going to be somebody in this new world. He's going to have the life he always wanted. And then he steps outside and immediately gets hit by a car and dies. That's the show's thesis on the multiverse in one moment. The grass isn't greener on the other side. It might not even be grass. The idea that another version of reality would solve your problems is a fantasy. And the multiverse exists not to provide escape, but to demonstrate that escape is impossible. Every reality has its own version of the same problems. You can travel to infinite universes and never find one where life is easy, because difficulty is baked into the fabric of existence itself. Human Brian crossed realities to find a better life, and found the bumper of a moving car instead. The multiverse remote also opens up the question of infinite Griffin families. If there are infinite realities, there are infinite versions of Peter, Lois, Stewie, Brian, Chris, and Meg. Every possible variation of every possible decision branches into its own universe. There's a universe where Peter is smart. There's a universe where Meg is popular. There's a universe where Brian is a successful novelist. There's a universe where the chicken fight never started because the coupon wasn't expired. Every missed opportunity, every road not taken, every random chance that went one way instead of another exists as a fully realised reality somewhere in the multiverse. The No Christianity universe is maybe the most provocative thought experiment the show has ever presented. In this reality, Christianity never existed. And without the dark ages that the show attributes to religious suppression of scientific progress, human civilization is roughly 1,000 years more advanced. People fly around in personal spacecraft. Technology is so advanced, it looks like magic. The world is clean, peaceful, and prosperous. The implication is clear and deliberately inflammatory. The show is arguing that organised religion held back human progress by centuries. And this is the world we could have had without it. Now, you can agree or disagree with that premise, but what's remarkable is that an animated comedy on network television was willing to present it at all. Most shows would never touch that topic with a 10-foot pole. Family Guy didn't just touch it, it built an entire alternate reality around it and showed it to the audience without hedging or apologising. The No Christianity universe isn't presented as a dystopia or a cautionary tale. It's presented as genuinely better. That takes guts regardless of whether you think the argument is valid. The Disney universe is a completely different kind of commentary. Stewie and Brian arrive in a reality that looks and feels exactly like a classic Disney animated film. The colours are brighter, the lines are softer, the characters burst into song. Animals are friendly and helpful. Everything is wholesome and sanitised and absolutely dripping with corporate-approved warmth. And the show plays this completely straight for about 2 minutes before the cracks start to show. The Disney universe isn't really better or worse than the normal Family Guy universe. It's just a different kind of fake. The normal Family Guy world is fake in the sense that it's a cartoon. The Disney universe is fake in the sense that it's a version of reality where unpleasant things have been edited out to create an emotional product. The transition from the Disney universe to the Robot Chicken universe is one of the most clever meta moments in the episode. Robot Chicken is Seth Green's show. Seth Green voices Chris Griffin on Family Guy, so when Stewie and Brian visit the Robot Chicken universe, they're essentially visiting a show made by one of their own cast members. The animation changes from traditional 2D to the stop-motion style of Robot Chicken. The humour changes from Family Guy's cutaway-based format to Robot Chicken's sketch-based format. And the characters find the experience deeply unsettling, which is the show's way of acknowledging that even shows in the same comedy family have fundamentally different DNA. The Japanese anime universe gets the most visual transformation. Stewie and Brian are suddenly rendered in full anime style, with the enormous eyes, the dramatic speed lines, the exaggerated emotional expressions, and the completely different approach to storytelling that defines Japanese animation. This is the show using the multiverse as an excuse to do something they could never normally do, which is animate an entire sequence in a completely different style. The animation team clearly had a blast with this, because the attention to detail is extraordinary. They didn't just slap anime eyes on Stewie and Brian, they recreated the entire visual language of anime, from the camera work to the pacing to the way action sequences are choreographed. But the universe that matters most, emotionally and thematically, is the dog-dominant universe. This is where Brian finds a world where dogs are the intelligent species and humans are the pets. Dogs walk upright, dogs have jobs, dogs run the government, humans are kept on leashes, fed from bowls and taken to the vet. It's a complete inversion of Brian's reality. And for Brian, it's paradise. He's finally in a world where being a dog means being on top. He's not the pet pretending to be a person. He's the person. He belongs. Brian wants to stay. He actually tries to stay in this universe permanently, which tells you everything about how miserable he is in the normal world. Given the option to live in a reality where his species isn't a disadvantage, Brian is willing to abandon his family, his friends, and his entire life. The multiverse remote breaks, stranding them, and the situation quickly goes dark. In the dog-dominant universe, a human version of Brian is treated the way dogs are treated in the normal world. He's neutered, he's kennelled, and eventually, human Brian is sent to the pound, which in this universe means execution. Stewie, being Stewie, finds a way to fix the remote and get them home. But the emotional impact of that universe lingers. Brian saw a world where he could be what he's always wanted to be, and he had to leave it. He had to go back to a reality where he's the pet, the other, the one who doesn't quite fit. The multiverse didn't just show Brian a different world, it showed him his deepest desire and then took it away. The episode won a Primetime Emmy for Greg Colton's animation, and many fans and critics consider it one of the best episodes Family Guy has ever produced. It's certainly the most ambitious in terms of visual variety, tonal range, and thematic depth. In 22 minutes, the episode manages to comment on religion, corporate entertainment, cultural imperialism, species identity, and the nature of reality itself, all while being genuinely funny and emotionally resonant. The philosophical implications of the Family Guy multiverse extend beyond the show. If there are infinite realities, and some of those realities have different rules of physics, different species, hierarchies, and different histories, then the question becomes whether any single reality can claim to be the real one. The normal Family Guy universe isn't more real than the dog universe, or the No Christianity universe. They're all equally valid. The characters we follow just happen to live in one particular version of infinity. This connects to a deeper question about fiction itself. Is the normal Family Guy universe more real than any other fictional universe? To the characters, it is. To the audience, None of them are real. The multiverse episode plays with this boundary by having the characters visit realities that feel like they belong to different shows, different networks, different countries. Stewie and Brian essentially become tourists in other people's fictions, which is what all television viewers are. We're just visiting someone else's imagined reality for 22 minutes before returning to our own. That's a staggering amount of narrative potential, and the show has barely scratched the surface of it. The multiverse episode proved that Family Guy can do high-concept science fiction, as well as any dedicated sci-fi show. It can explore philosophical questions about identity and determinism, while also making jokes about anime and Disney. The multiverse is the show's most powerful narrative tool, and unlike the time machine, which has been used extensively, the multiverse remote has mostly been limited to a single definitive episode. The multiverse also interacts with the show's meta-awareness in interesting ways. If there are infinite realities, one of those realities is a reality where Family Guy is just a TV show. In fact, the characters have acknowledged that they're in a TV show multiple times. The multiverse provides a theoretical framework for that awareness. Maybe the Family Guy characters can break the fourth wall because somewhere in the infinite set of all possible realities, there's a version of their world that exists as entertainment for another world. The multiverse doesn't just explain the show's physics, it explains its metaphysics. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go deeper into how the show sees itself, let's look backwards, way backwards, because the Griffin family tree goes back centuries, and it is, without question, the most unhinged genealogy in television history. The Griffin family tree is what would happen if you took a normal genealogy chart, set it on fire, and then tried to reconstruct it while drunk. Every branch leads to something insane. Every ancestor did something terrible. And every generation somehow produced people who are exactly as chaotic as the generation before them, which means the dysfunction isn't a bug in the Griffin DNA. It's the operating system. The show laid out the most comprehensive version of the family history in untitled Griffin Family History, which takes place in Peter's panic room during a home invasion. The family is trapped in this small steel room with no phone and no way out, so Peter decides to pass the time by telling stories about their ancestors. And the stories he tells are, without exception, completely unhinged. He starts at the beginning. The literal beginning. According to Peter, the Big Bang was caused by God farting through a lit lighter. That's the Griffin version of the creation of the universe. Not a cosmic singularity, not divine will, a celestial fart ignited by a Bic lighter. From there, Peter moves through the Paleolithic Age, where a caveman version of Peter invented the wheel. Then the Bronze Age, where Moses Griffin led the Israelites to freedom but apparently modified the commandments along the way. The implication being that whatever the original commandments said, a Griffin got his hands on them and made changes for personal convenience. The family has been editing reality since biblical times. The Nate Griffin storyline is probably the most significant piece of Griffin ancestry. Nate was a black slave owned by the Pewterschmidt family. This means that Peter, through Nate, has African-American ancestry, and Lois, through the Pewterschmidts, comes from the family that owned Peter's ancestor. Peter and Lois are connected not just by marriage, but by a shared history of slavery and ownership. They are, in a sense, distantly related through the intersection of their family trees in the worst possible way. When Peter discovers this in the episode, Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, he goes to Carter Pewterschmidt to demand reparations. Carter gives him $20,000 to never mention it again. Peter immediately squanders the money converting the living room into a replica of Pee-wee's Playhouse, which angers both Lois and, somehow, Peter's new black brothers, who are disappointed in how he spent the reparation money. The episode tries to deal with race, slavery, and reparations through the lens of Family Guy comedy, which means it's simultaneously more thoughtful and more offensive than you'd expect from any other show. Nate Griffin himself is portrayed as a prankster, even in captivity. On the slave ship, he pulled a prank on the captain by cutting the floor around the captain's bed and floating it out to sea, so the captain woke up in the middle of the ocean. Even in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, a griffin found a way to be chaotic. The family's defining characteristic isn't intelligence or strength or morality, it's chaos. Every griffin in every era creates disorder wherever they go. Some of them do it on purpose. Most of them do it accidentally. But the result is always the same. A griffin enters a situation, and that situation becomes worse, funnier, or more complicated than it was before. The Peter-Hitler connection is one of the show's most audacious bits of family lore. Peter's great-uncle was Peter Hitler, the brother of Adolf Hitler. Peter Hitler isn't evil. He's just annoying. He's that relative who shows up uninvited and won't leave. He asks inappropriate questions. He overstays his welcome. He's socially oblivious in the way that all Peters are socially oblivious. The joke is that Adolf's brother was essentially a Griffin-type personality, a well-meaning bumbler who happened to share a last name with history's greatest monster. The show doesn't glorify or minimise the Holocaust. It just imagines a world where Hitler had a really annoying brother, and that brother was related to Peter Griffin. There's also a John Wilkes Griffin who shot Abraham Lincoln, but not for political reasons. It was over a photo prank. A Griffin assassinated a president because of a personal grievance so trivial that history probably wouldn't have recorded it if the victim hadn't been the leader of the free world. That's the Griffin way. Epic consequences from petty motivations. The chicken fight started over an expired coupon. The Lincoln assassination started over a photo. Griffins don't do things for grand reasons. They do things for stupid reasons that somehow have grand outcomes. Willie Black-Eye Griffin was a silent film actor, giving the family a connection to early Hollywood. Josiah Griffin supposedly designed Bugs Bunny, which means the Griffin family has influenced American pop culture at its most fundamental level. And Griffin Peterson founded the town of Quahog itself after being exiled from England. The Griffins didn't just live in Quahog, they created it. The town exists because a Griffin was kicked out of another country and needed somewhere to go. Quahog is basically a colony established by the Griffin family's inability to get along with their neighbours, which tracks perfectly with how Peter interacts with his own community. Now the father situation adds another layer of complexity. For most of the show's early run, Peter's father is Francis Griffin, a deeply devout Catholic man who is stern, judgmental, and frequently cruel to Peter. Francis dies in one episode after Peter accidentally falls on him while performing at Meg's birthday party dressed as a clown. On his deathbed, Francis's last words to Peter are calling him a fat, stinking drunk. Even in death, a Griffin can't resist being hurtful to another Griffin. But after Francis's death, Peter discovers that Francis wasn't his biological father at all. Peter's mother had an affair with an Irishman while vacationing in Ireland. Peter's real father is Mickey McFinnigan, the town drunk of McSwiggan village in Ireland. Peter and Brian travel to Ireland to find him, and when they do, Mickey doesn't believe Peter is his son. So Peter challenges him to a drinking contest and wins. This proves to Mickey that Peter must be his biological offspring, because apparently the ability to drink heroic quantities of alcohol is genetic in the McFinnigan family, and only a true McFinnigan could outdrink another McFinnigan. The fact that Peter's real father is an Irish town drunk explains a lot about Peter's personality. The alcoholism has a genetic component. The stubbornness is inherited. The charm mixed with self-destruction is a family trait. Peter isn't just a random collection of character quirks. He's the product of two family lines, the Griffins and the McFinnigans, that both specialise in chaos, substance abuse, and an inability to leave well enough alone. Peter also has a sister named Karen who is a bully, which retroactively explains a lot about how Peter treats Meg. The cruelty in the family isn't something Peter invented, it's something he grew up with. He was bullied by his sister. He was emotionally neglected by Francis. He was abandoned by his biological father. Peter's treatment of Meg isn't just a running joke. It's a cycle of abuse that goes back at least one generation, and probably further. The Griffins don't just carry dysfunction forward through time. They refine it. Each generation finds new and more creative ways to be terrible to each other, while simultaneously being unable to function without each other. The Pewterschmidt side of the family is its own nightmare. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is a billionaire who earned his fortune through means that the show regularly implies were unethical at best and criminal at worst. Carter is old money, New England wealth, the kind of person who has a yacht and a mansion and a casual disregard for anyone who isn't also a billionaire. He despises Peter. He's tried to break up Peter and Lois's marriage multiple times. He's bribed, manipulated, and threatened his own family members. Carter represents the worst of American capitalism wrapped in a country club blazer. Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, has her own secrets. The show has established that Barbara's grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, which means the Pewterschmidt family has Jewish ancestry that they've kept hidden behind their wasp exterior. This revelation comes in the episode Family Goy, where Lois discovers her heritage and the family briefly explores what it means to be Jewish. Peter embraces it enthusiastically, then abandons it just as quickly. The episode treats religious identity as something the Griffins try on and discard like a costume, which is probably the most honest depiction of how some families actually deal with complicated heritage. The family tree, when you look at it all together, tells a story about America itself. The Griffins have ancestors who were slaves and ancestors who owned slaves, who owned. They have connections to the founding of towns, the assassination of presidents, the creation of popular culture, and the perpetuation of historical trauma. They're Irish and American and African American and Jewish and Catholic and everything in between. They're a melting pot family in the most literal sense, with every strand of American history woven into their DNA. And every single ancestor shares the same fundamental trait. They made things worse, or funnier, or both. The Griffins have been destabilizing situations since the beginning of recorded history, and there's no sign of that changing. Peter is the latest in a long line of Griffins who leave chaos in their wake, and his children will presumably carry that tradition forward. Chris already shows signs of it. Stewie has elevated it to an art form. Even Meg, in her own way, contributes to the cycle by absorbing the family's dysfunction so thoroughly that she becomes part of its structure. The Griffin family tree isn't just a collection of funny historical references. It's a thesis about heredity, about how families pass down not just genes but patterns. Patterns of behaviour, patterns of conflict, patterns of self-destruction. The Griffins don't learn from their history because their history isn't something they study. It's something they repeat. Every generation thinks they're unique, and every generation makes the same mistakes in slightly different costumes. Peter Hitler annoyed his family in 1940s Germany. Peter Griffin annoys his family in modern-day Rhode Island. The setting changes. The Griffin stays the same. The Nate Griffin storyline is the one that creates the most uncomfortable implications. Nate Griffin was an African slave owned by the Pewterschmidt family, Lois's ancestors. At some point in history, Nate married a Pewterschmidt, which means Peter and Lois are distantly related through their family trees. The show doesn't dwell on this, it doesn't. It drops the information and moves on, treating it as just another weird fact about the Griffin genealogy. But if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it means the central marriage of the entire show is technically between distant cousins whose family connection runs through the history of American slavery. This is a comedy show doing this. A primetime animated comedy casually revealed that its main couple is connected through slavery and interracial marriage across generations, and then never brought it up again. The Griffin's family tree doesn't just include embarrassing relatives, it includes the entire painful history of race in America, compressed into a genealogy chart and played for laughs. Peter's discovery that Francis Griffin wasn't his real father is another seismic revelation that the show treats with surprising emotional weight before defaulting back to comedy. Francis, the devout Catholic man who raised Peter and spent decades being disappointed in him, wasn't Peter's biological father at all. Peter's real father is Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drunk living in a small town in Ireland. Peter travels to Ireland to find him, and the reunion is genuinely emotional for about 3 minutes before Peter and Mickey get into a drinking contest. And the episode becomes a comedy about Irish stereotypes. But the emotional weight of that revelation lingers beneath the surface of later episodes. Peter was raised by a man who didn't like him, who constantly criticised him, who made Peter feel inadequate at every turn. And that man wasn't even his real father. Peter's entire upbringing was shaped by a paternal relationship built on a lie. Francis's disappointment in Peter takes on a different dimension when you realise that Francis may have been projecting his resentment about the situation onto a child who didn't ask to be born into it. Peter also has a sister named Karen who is a bully. She torments Peter the same way Peter torments Meg, which means the Griffin cycle of abuse didn't start with Peter. It started at least one generation earlier. Karen bullied Peter. Peter bullies Meg. If Meg ever has children, the pattern might continue. The Griffins don't just pass down genetic traits, they pass down dysfunction. Each generation inherits the previous generation's trauma and inflicts it on the next generation in a slightly different form. The Pewterschmidt side of the family is its own treasure trove of dark history. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is a billionaire industrialist who openly despises Peter. Barbara, Lois's mother, comes from a family with Holocaust connections. The show reveals that Barbara's grandmother had an absurdly stereotypical name that we won't repeat here, which is the show's characteristically tasteless way of acknowledging the Jewish heritage in the Pewterschmidt bloodline. Carter's wealth came from somewhere, and the show implies that it came from a long history of exploitation. The Pewterschmidts owned slaves. They accumulated industrial wealth during periods of American history when labour protections were non-existent. They married into other wealthy families to consolidate power. Carter's fortune isn't just money, it's the accumulated product of generations of privilege. And the show occasionally contrasts this with Peter's working-class background to make points about class in America. The Quahog founder, Griffin Peterson, was banished from England and came to the New World to start over. This is a deliberate parallel to the actual founding mythology of New England, where Puritans fled religious persecution in England and established new colonies in Massachusetts and the surrounding areas. Except Griffin Peterson wasn't fleeing persecution. He was fleeing because he'd done something terrible enough to get kicked out of an entire country. The Griffin tradition of causing problems and then moving somewhere new to avoid the consequences apparently goes back to the colonial era. What makes the Griffin family tree so effective as comedy and as commentary is the consistency of the pattern. Every single generation produces someone who is chaotic, destructive, socially inappropriate, and somehow involved in a major historical event. The Griffins didn't just witness history, they caused it, usually by accident, usually through some combination of stupidity and bad luck. It's like Forrest Gump, but instead of being present at important moments through innocent coincidence, the Griffins are present because they started the fire, or offended the wrong person, or simply stumbled into the worst possible situation at the worst possible time. The implication is that the modern Griffin family isn't an aberration. They're not uniquely dysfunctional. They're the latest installment in a centuries-long tradition of dysfunction. Peter isn't unusually stupid or careless. He's exactly as stupid and careless as his ancestors were, which means his behaviour isn't a personal failing. It's hereditary. The chaos isn't something that happened to the Griffins. It's something the Griffins are. It's in their blood, their history, their DNA. Every generation gets a fresh start and immediately ruins it in a way that's consistent with how every previous generation ruined theirs. If you want to understand who Peter Griffin is, don't look at Peter. Look at his ancestors. Look at Nate Griffin pranking the ship captain. Look at Moses Griffin editing the commandments. Look at Griffin Peterson founding a town because he got kicked out of his last one. Peter comes from a long line of people who couldn't stop themselves, and he's exactly who you'd expect him to be given that lineage. The family tree doesn't explain everything about the Griffins, but it explains enough. Speaking of things that shouldn't work but somehow do, let's talk about the economy of Quahog. Because this is a fictional town that runs on the most insane economic principles ever conceived, and nobody seems to notice. Quahog, Rhode Island, is a town that should not exist. Not because it's fictional, though it is, but because the economic principles that govern this town violate every known law of commerce, employment, and basic common sense. The infrastructure gets destroyed on a regular basis. The primary employer is a brewery that seems to have no quality control, and an employee who has been officially classified as mentally disabled. The bar that serves as the social centre of the town appears to have exactly 4 regular customers, and the tax base that would be required to maintain roads, schools, hospitals, and emergency services in a town that experiences a catastrophic event roughly every other week would bankrupt any real municipality within months. Let's start with the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, because it's the economic engine that drives Quahog's entire existence. Peter works here. Most of the town seems to depend on it for employment, either directly or indirectly. And the origin story of the brewery is a horror movie disguised as a local legend. Pawtucket Pat, the town hero whose statue stands in the public square and whose name is on the beer, stole his beer recipe from Native Americans and then killed them to cover his tracks. The founding mythology of Quahog's most important business is theft and murder. The entire economic foundation of this town is built on a crime, and the town celebrates that crime with a statue and a brand name. The show actually addresses this directly in the Pawtucket Pat episode, where the truth about Pawtucket Pat is revealed and the town has to reckon with the fact that their beloved founder was a murderer and a thief. But the reckoning doesn't last long, because the town depends on the brewery too much to care about its origin. The jobs are more important than the justice. The beer is more important than the history. Quahog makes a brief gesture toward accountability and then goes right back to normal, which is probably the most realistic depiction of how American towns actually deal with problematic founding myths. Peter's employment at the brewery is its own economic anomaly. He's been fired and rehired so many times that the brewery's HR department would need to be either criminally negligent or deeply compassionate to keep bringing him back. He drinks on the job. He causes accidents. He's been demoted to working under people who are objectively less qualified than him in most areas, but more qualified than him in the specific area of not destroying everything they touch. He once poured hot grease on his wife because of something that happened at work. The liability insurance alone for having Peter Griffin as an employee would probably exceed the brewery's annual revenue. But Peter keeps coming back because the show needs him to have a job, and the brewery is where that job is. His employment isn't governed by economics, it's governed by narrative necessity. The writers need Peter to have a workplace where funny things can happen, and the brewery provides that workplace. The fact that no real brewery would employ Peter for more than a day is irrelevant because Quahog's economy doesn't run on market forces. It runs on storytelling convenience. Before the brewery, Peter worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory, which was bought by El Dorado Cigarettes in Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington. The toy factory started making cigarette-promoting toys for kids. Peter got made president of the company, went to Congress, and accidentally bankrupted the cigarette company by convincing legislators to fine them $100 million. So Peter's pre-brewery career includes accidentally destroying an entire corporation through a combination of stupidity and accidental righteousness. That's a pretty impressive economic footprint for someone who can't spell his own name consistently. The Drunken Clam is the social heart of Quahog, and it operates on the most baffling business model in the hospitality industry. The bar appears to have 4 regular customers: Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland, who left for a while and then came back. Occasionally, other people are shown in the bar, but the 4 guys are there every single time. They drink beer, they sit on the same stools, they have the same conversations, and somehow the Clam stays in business. Horace ran the Clam for years. He was eventually killed, which the show handled with varying degrees of gravity. The bar was taken over by new management, but the vibe stayed the same. At one point in the early seasons, a hurricane convinces Horace to sell the bar, and an Englishman turns it into a British pub, which causes Peter and friends to stage a protest modelled on the Boston Tea Party, but with beer instead of tea. The pub mysteriously burns down, and the Clam returns to its original state. The bar's identity is so fundamental to the show that the universe literally conspires to preserve it. Think about the economics of running a bar with 4 main customers in a town that experiences regular catastrophic events. The revenue from Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland buying beers a few nights a week would barely cover the electric bill, let alone rent, insurance, staff, and inventory. The Clam should have closed years ago, but it persists for the same reason the Griffin House persists. It's narratively necessary. The show needs a place where the guys gather, and the Clam is that place. Its economic viability is secondary to its dramatic function. Goldman's Pharmacy is another Quahog institution that seems to defy commercial logic. Mort Goldman runs it with a level of neurotic anxiety that would drive most customers to the CVS across town. The pharmacy has been a fixture of the show for years, serving as Mort's base of operations and a reliable location for scenes that need a commercial setting. Mort himself is one of the show's most reliable supporting characters, a nervous Jewish pharmacist who gets dragged into adventures he wants no part of, and who somehow survived a trip to Nazi-occupied Poland through Stewie's time machine. The Quahog news team adds another dimension to the town's economy. Tom Tucker and the various news anchors work for a local news station that covers the insane events of Quahog with the same deadpan professionalism that real local news anchors bring to stories about school board meetings and highway construction. The difference is that Quahog's news includes regular appearances by death, giant chicken fights, time travel incidents, and whatever Peter's latest scheme has produced. The fact that the news team covers all of this with straight faces suggests either extreme professionalism or a complete detachment from reality. Either way, someone is paying them a salary and someone is watching the broadcasts. Peter's job history beyond the brewery is a resume that would make any employer run screaming. He's been a fisherman, a Renaissance fair performer, a TV personality with the what really grinds my gears segment, a company president, a folk hero, a tobacco company spokesman, a taxi driver, a professional wrestler, a country music singer, and about 40 other things, each for approximately 1 episode before the status quo reasserts itself. Peter has held more jobs than most people hold in 10 lifetimes, and he's been fired from nearly all of them. His employment record is a monument to American underemployment, where a person can cycle through dozens of careers without ever finding one that sticks because the system doesn't know what to do with someone who is simultaneously unkillable and unemployable. The Mayor Adam West situation adds a layer of absurdity to Quahog's governance. The real Adam West, the actor famous for playing Batman in the 1960s TV series, voiced a fictionalized version of himself as the Mayor of Quahog. This wasn't a cameo. This was a recurring character who served as mayor for years. Mayor Adam West made policy decisions based on personal whims, paranoid fantasies, and whatever crossed his mind at any given moment. He married Peter's sister-in-law, Carol. He made bizarre proclamations. He was clearly unfit for public office by any rational standard. And he kept getting re-elected because the citizens of Quahog either didn't care or actively preferred chaos. When the real Adam West passed away in 2018, the show retired the character with genuine respect and eventually introduced a new mayor named Mayor Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott. The transition was handled with more grace than you'd expect, acknowledging the real loss while maintaining the show's tradition of having a mayor who operates outside the bounds of conventional governance. The mayor of Quahog isn't a political figure. He's a comedic device. The office exists to generate absurdity, not to simulate actual municipal government. James Woods High School, where Chris and Meg attend, is named after the actor James Woods, who has appeared in the show multiple times as a fictionalized version of himself. Naming a public school after a living celebrity is unusual. Naming it after James Woods specifically is a choice that suggests Quahog School Board is as chaotic as everything else in the town. The school itself seems to provide a standard education, though the standardized test scores are apparently low enough that the school has lost federal funding and had to cut its budget to the point of using hopelessly outdated textbooks. That's the No Child Left Behind subplot from the Chris Gets Expelled episode, which is also the episode with the chicken fight at the Ferris wheel. The medical system in Quahog is run primarily by Dr. Hartman, who is a recurring character of questionable medical competence. He's treated the Griffins for everything from pregnancy to cancer scares to injuries sustained during chicken fights, and his diagnostic abilities seem to range from occasionally accurate to wildly wrong. In one episode, he was found running a drug den. The fact that Quahog's primary healthcare provider has a side business in illegal narcotics tells you everything you need to know about the town's relationship with professional standards. Quahog also has a functioning legal system, though functioning is generous. Joe Swanson is a police officer, and he appears to be one of very few competent members of the Quahog police force. The courts hear cases ranging from custody disputes to criminal trials, and the outcomes are usually determined more by comedy than by law. Peter has talked his way out of legal consequences numerous times. Characters have committed acts that would result in serious prison time in the real world and walked away with no punishment. The legal system in Quahog isn't broken. It's just optional. The law applies when the plot needs it to apply and evaporates when the plot needs it to evaporate. The most remarkable thing about Quahog's economy is how it survives the regular destruction. Property damage in this town must be astronomical. The chicken fights alone have leveled buildings, destroyed vehicles, and compromised infrastructure across multiple city blocks. Peter has personally destroyed sections of the town through various schemes and accidents. Natural disasters, supernatural events, and the general chaos of daily life in Quahog should have rendered the town uninhabitable and uninsurable years ago. But Quahog rebuilds, always without explanation, without apparent funding, without anyone asking how a small town in Rhode Island can afford to reconstruct itself every other week. Quahog functions like Springfield from The Simpsons in this regard. It's a fictional town that exists to serve the story, with an economy that adjusts to whatever the narrative requires. Need Peter to be employed? The brewery has a job? Need a social gathering place? The clam is open? Need a school for the kids? James Woods High is there. Need a hospital? Dr. Hartman is available, and he might even diagnose you correctly. The town isn't a real place with real economics. It's a set, a collection of locations that exist because characters need places to go, and the economy is just the invisible hand of the writers ensuring that those places are always available when needed. But there's something almost comforting about that. Quahog can't fail because it's not trying to succeed. It's not competing with other towns or states or countries. It's not worried about GDP or unemployment or infrastructure spending. It just exists, unconditionally, as a place where a fat man and his talking dog and his genius baby and his neglected daughter and his dim son and his long-suffering wife can live their insane lives without the real world intruding. The economy of Quahog is sustained by the same force that sustains the Griffin House, the Time Machine, and the chicken fights. It's sustained by the show's absolute refusal to let reality get in the way of a good time. The Quahog economy section also deserves deeper exploration on a few points. The Pawtucket Brewery story is darker than most people realise. The town's biggest employer was built on a stolen recipe. Pawtucket Pat, the founder, didn't just steal the recipe from Native Americans, he killed them. The episode Pawtucket Pat reveals that the beloved town mascot, the guy whose statue stands in the town square, whose face is on every bottle of Pawtucket Patriot Ale, was a murderer and a thief. The entire economic foundation of Quahog rests on genocide and intellectual property theft. And here's the kicker, the town doesn't care. When the truth comes out, there's a brief moment of discomfort, and then everyone goes back to drinking the beer and celebrating the brand. The show is making a point about how communities build mythologies around their founding that can't survive actual scrutiny, and how people will choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths every time. Quahog knows its hero was a villain. Quahog drinks his beer anyway. The drunken clam is economically impossible. A bar that survives primarily on the patronage of 4 regular customers shouldn't be able to keep its doors open. Peter, Joe, Quagmire and Cleveland are there almost every day, but there's no way their bar tabs are covering rent, utilities, inventory and staff salaries. Horace, the original bartender, ran the place for years before being killed off and replaced. The bar has been threatened with closure multiple times, been bought out and transformed by an English investor, and been the site of numerous incidents that would void any insurance policy in existence. Yet it persists. The drunken clam persists for the same reason 31 Spooner Street persists. The show needs it. It's a narrative anchor point where important conversations happen, where plots get started, where the male characters gather to process their lives. It's the masculine counterpart to the Griffin living room. The living room is where family dynamics play out. The clam is where friendship dynamics play out. Without both locations, the show loses 2 of its most important staging areas. The revolving door of Peter's employment history tells its own economic story. He's worked at the toy factory, the Pawtucket Brewery, as a fisherman, a Renaissance fair performer, a TV personality with his You Know What Really Grinds My Gears segment, the president of a tobacco company, and literally dozens of one-episode jobs that he gets and loses within 22 minutes. Peter has had more jobs than most people have in a lifetime, and he's been equally mediocre at all of them. The gig economy of Quahog seems specifically designed to accommodate Peter's chaotic employment patterns. There's always another job available. There's always someone willing to hire a man who's been fired from every previous position for incompetence, negligence, or destruction of property. The town has an infinite supply of employment opportunities for a man with 0 qualifications and a history of catastrophic workplace incidents. Either Quahog has the most forgiving job market in America, or Peter has some quality that employers find irresistible, despite all evidence suggesting they should run the other way. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the real Adam West until his death in 2017, was the perfect leader for this kind of economy. He was completely insane, made decisions based on whims and delusions, and the town loved him for it. After Adam West's passing, the show respectfully retired the character and replaced him with Mayor Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, who brought a completely different energy, but the same fundamental principle. The mayor of Quahog doesn't need to be competent, he needs to be entertaining. The town runs on vibes, not governance, and as long as the vibes are right, nobody questions the infrastructure. If you're still awake, we're getting close to the end now. And I want to talk about two more things before we wrap up. First, let's talk about death, not the concept, the character. Because death in Family Guy is one of the most underrated recurring characters in the show, and his existence says something genuinely interesting about how the show thinks about mortality. But before that, if you're enjoying this journey through Family Guy's insanity, just gently tap that subscribe button. We do this kind of deep dive all the time, and you don't want to miss the next one. Alright, let's talk about the Grim Reaper. Death in the Family Guy universe is not a concept. He's a guy. He's a guy with a job, a social life, personal insecurities, and a mother he still lives with. He wears the traditional black robe and carries a scythe, because that's the dress code for his profession. But underneath all of that, he's just a dude trying to get through his shift. And that might be the most brilliant creative decision the show ever made about a supernatural character, because it takes the most terrifying concept in human existence and reduces it to a workplace comedy. The first major death episode is Death is a Bitch from Season 2, and it establishes everything you need to know about how the show treats mortality. Peter finds a lump on his chest and panics about cancer. It turns out to be benign, just a fatty deposit, but Peter doesn't want to pay the hospital bill. So he does what any reasonable person would do. He declares himself deceased on the insurance form to avoid the charge. This triggers an actual visit from Death because the universe's bureaucracy takes Peter's fake death certificate at face value. Death shows up at the Griffin house to collect Peter's soul. Peter does what Peter always does when confronted with something terrifying. He runs, Death chases him, and during the chase, Death trips, falls, and sprains his ankle. The Grim Reaper, the cosmic force responsible for ending all mortal life, sprains his ankle chasing a fat man through Quahog, Rhode Island. He's incapacitated. He can't do his job, and because Death can't work, nobody can die. The consequences of immortality hit Quahog immediately. People realize they can't be killed and start doing insane things. They jump off buildings, they walk into traffic, they pick fights they would normally avoid. The entire social contract that keeps human behavior in check. The fear of death evaporates overnight and society starts coming apart. This is actually a pretty sophisticated thought experiment buried inside a comedy episode. What happens when people stop fearing the end? The show's answer is chaos, not liberation, not enlightenment. Chaos, because human beings aren't held together by hope or love or community. They're held together by the knowledge that everything ends. And when that knowledge disappears, so does every reason to be careful. Peter is forced to fill in for Death while his ankle heals. Death assigns him to kill the cast of Dawson's Creek by causing their plane to crash, which is the show's way of commenting on teen drama that has overstayed its welcome. But Peter can't do it. He sees that innocent passengers would die along with the Dawson's Creek actors, and he refuses. Instead, he accidentally kills 2 airplane pilots, which proves to the world that death is still possible, and the natural order is restored. Death heals up and goes back to work. Peter goes back to being alive. The status quo returns. But what's interesting about that episode isn't the plot, it's the characterization of Death himself. He's not menacing, he's not evil, he's not even particularly intimidating once you get past the robe and the skeletal face. He's just doing a job. He has a schedule. He has assignments. He has a boss, presumably, though we never meet them. Death is a bureaucrat. He's the cosmic equivalent of a DMV employee, except instead of processing license renewals, he processes the end of human consciousness. The show strips death of its grandeur and replaces it with the mundane, and somehow that makes it more relatable, not less. In Friends of Peter G. from Season 9, Death gives Peter a second chance after a car accident that kills him. This is a significant episode because it's one of the few times the show deals with Peter's alcoholism as a genuine problem rather than just a character trait. Peter crashes his car while drunk and actually dies. Death shows up, and instead of immediately taking Peter's soul, he decides to show Peter what his life would look like under two different scenarios. In the first scenario, Peter is a heavy drinker for the rest of his life. The show depicts what full-blown alcoholism actually looks like within the Griffin family. Peter abuses Lois and the kids. The family falls apart. The warmth and chaos that make the Griffin household functional, if dysfunctional, gets replaced by something darker and more destructive. Alcoholic Peter isn't funny. He's frightening. The show commits to showing the real consequences of drinking to excess, and it's one of the most tonally serious sequences in the entire series. In the second scenario, Peter is completely sober, no alcohol at all, and the show depicts this as equally devastating, just in a different direction. Sober Peter is boring. He's a complete bore. He has no personality. He can't connect with his friends. He can't enjoy life. The fun, the spontaneity, the reckless energy that makes Peter who he is disappears entirely without alcohol. Sober Peter is safe but lifeless. The family is technically better off, but nobody's happy, including Peter. Death's message is moderation. Not sobriety, not indulgence, the middle path. Peter decides to throw out half the cans of beer he buys. He'll still drink, but less. It's a compromise between the two extremes that Death showed him. And what makes this episode work is that Death delivers this lesson not as a cosmic moral authority, but as a practical advisor. He's not preaching about the sanctity of life. He's just showing Peter the data and letting him make his own decision. Death is a career counselor for the afterlife, helping people optimize their remaining time on Earth. The personal life of Death, as revealed across multiple episodes, is genuinely sad. He lives with his mother. He has trouble dating because of an obvious occupational hazard. He can't touch anyone without killing them. Think about that for a second. The fundamental human need for physical contact, for touch, for warmth, for connection through the body is permanently denied to Death. He can never hug anyone. He can never shake hands. He can never hold a romantic partner. Every physical interaction carries the risk of ending a life. Death is the loneliest character in the entire show, including Brian, including Stewie, including Meg, because their loneliness comes from not being understood. Death's loneliness comes from not being able to be close to anyone, literally, without destroying them. He has a crush at various points in the series, but he can never pursue it. Romance for Death is a theoretical exercise. He can want companionship. He can imagine what it would be like, but he can never have it because his very nature makes intimacy fatal. Every love story needs touch, and Death's touch is the end of all stories. There's a Greek tragedy buried in this characterization. Death is a figure of infinite power and infinite isolation. He can end any life with a gesture, and that same power ensures he will never be able to share his life with anyone else. The show wisely plays most of this for comedy rather than pathos, because sustained pathos about Death's loneliness would be unbearable. Instead, Death is awkward. He's socially clumsy. He makes bad jokes. He tries too hard to be liked. He's the supernatural equivalent of that co-worker who desperately wants to be invited to happy hour, but never quite fits in with the group. Peter befriends him, sort of, in the way that Peter befriends everyone, which is temporarily and chaotically. But even Peter's friendship can only go so far, because Peter is mortal and Death is not. Their friendship has an expiration date that Death can see and Peter can't, and that asymmetry defines every interaction between them. There's a comparison worth making here to SpongeBob's Flying Dutchman, another animated show's personification of death and the supernatural. The Flying Dutchman is a ghost pirate who haunts Bikini Bottom, and like Family Guy's Death, he's lonely and insecure. He wants to be feared, but he also wants to be liked. He has personal problems that have nothing to do with being a supernatural entity. Both characters take something cosmic and make it personal, which is why they work. Nobody relates to the abstract concept of death, but everybody relates to being lonely. Everybody relates to wanting friends. Everybody relates to being bad at their job sometimes. By giving death human vulnerabilities, both shows make mortality itself feel more approachable. But there's a key difference. The Flying Dutchman exists in a world where death doesn't really have consequences. Nobody in SpongeBob dies permanently. The stakes are always low. Family Guy's Death exists in a world where death sometimes has enormous consequences, like Brian's death and the show's handling of various character deaths over the years, and sometimes has no consequences at all, like the countless background characters who die in chicken fights and explosions. The show can't decide if death matters, and Death himself seems to embody that ambiguity. He takes his job seriously some of the time, and treats it as a chore the rest of the time. He's as inconsistent about mortality as the show itself. When Brian died in Life of Brian, Death wasn't involved in the episode in any significant way. Brian was hit by a car, taken to the vet, and died surrounded by his family. It was treated with genuine, emotional weight. No appearance from Death as a character. No comedy about the afterlife, just loss. The show chose to keep Death out of the most significant death in its history, which was a smart creative decision, because inserting the comedic death character into Brian's farewell would have undermined the sincerity of the moment. Death works as a character in episodes about death as a concept, but when death gets personal, when it actually hurts, the show knows to keep him off screen. There are other deaths in the show that the writers treated with varying degrees of gravity. Muriel Goldman, Mort's wife, dies and it's played relatively straight. Horace, the drunken clam bartender, is killed by a fastball during a softball game, and his death triggers a storyline about the future of the bar. Mayor Adam West's retirement from the show after the real Adam West's death was handled with respect. Diane Simmons, the news anchor, was killed off in a Thanksgiving episode. Each death is treated differently, and the inconsistency is part of the show's DNA. Some deaths matter. Some don't. Some characters get mourned. Some get forgotten. The show never establishes a consistent policy on mortality, because having a consistent policy would mean committing to one tone, and Family Guy refuses to commit to anything. Death as a character embodies this refusal. He's simultaneously a cosmic authority figure and a punchline. He controls the most important transition in human existence, and he lives with his mum. He wields ultimate power, and he sprains his ankle chasing Peter Griffin. He's terrifying on paper and pathetic in practice, and that contrast is what makes him work as a Family Guy character. He's the perfect representative of a show that can't decide if it wants to be deep or dumb, meaningful or meaningless, sincere or satirical. Death is all of those things at once, just like the show that created him. The afterlife in Family Guy, as depicted through various episodes, is presented as exactly the kind of bureaucratic, impersonal, slightly disappointing system that you'd expect from a show that turned the Grim Reaper into a lonely guy with ankle problems. Heaven exists, hell exists, But neither one is as dramatic as you'd hope or fear. The afterlife is another institution, like a hospital or a government office, where things take too long, the staff is overworked, and the experience falls short of the brochure. When Peter visits the afterlife in various episodes, he's not overwhelmed by divine majesty or infernal torment. He's underwhelmed. The afterlife is just another place, and like every other place in Peter's life, it fails to live up to expectations. That's the quietly brilliant thing about Death in Family Guy. By making Death a character, by giving him a personality and problems and a social life, the show domesticates the thing we're most afraid of. Death isn't waiting in the shadows with a scythe. He's sitting in his mum's living room, eating cereal. He's not going to drag you to eternal darkness. He's going to awkwardly show up at your house, trip on the front steps, and ask if you can help him with his ankle. The terror evaporates, the mystery dissolves, and what's left is just another person, doing their job, wishing they could find someone to have dinner with. Death's inability to touch anyone without killing them creates what might be the loneliest existence of any character on the show. Think about what that means in practical terms. He can never hug anyone. He can never shake hands. He can never have physical intimacy of any kind. Every interaction he has with another being has to maintain a careful physical distance, because one accidental brush of skin means the other person dies. Death lives in a world full of people and can't touch a single one of them. The show uses this as comedy, obviously. Death goes on a date and has to explain why he can't hold hands. Death tries to help someone up and they die. But underneath the comedy, there's a metaphor that's almost too on the nose. Death represents the ultimate form of social isolation. He's the person that everyone needs, but nobody wants. He performs an essential function in the universe, and the universe rewards him with permanent loneliness. He can't quit. He can't retire. He can't call in sick. He just keeps collecting souls, day after day, going home to his mother's house and hoping that maybe tomorrow will be different, even though it never is. The Friends of Peter G episode, where Death gives Peter a second chance after a car crash, is one of the more philosophically interesting Death episodes. Death shows Peter two possible futures. In one, Peter becomes a raging alcoholic who destroys his family. In the other, Peter gets completely sober and becomes so boring that his family can barely stand to be around him. Neither future is good. The lesson isn't sobriety or indulgence, it's moderation. Peter throws out half his beer, keeping just enough to be himself, without losing everything. This is Death acting as a moral teacher, which is a role that goes back to medieval allegory. The figure of Death appearing to mortals and showing them the consequences of their choices is one of the oldest storytelling devices in Western literature. Family Guy takes this ancient tradition and filters it through the sensibility of a show where the Grim Reaper is a socially awkward nerd who lives with his mum. The moral lesson still lands. It just lands differently when it's being delivered by a guy in a robe who can't get a date. Compare Death in Family Guy to the Flying Dutchman in SpongeBob SquarePants. Both are supernatural beings who represent death or the afterlife. Both are portrayed as lonely figures who want companionship more than they want to be feared. Both use their terrifying reputations as a shield for their insecurities. The Flying Dutchman haunts Bikini Bottom because he's bored and lonely, not because he's malevolent. Death collects souls in Quahog because it's his job, not because he enjoys it. Both shows arrived at the same insight independently. The thing we're most afraid of is actually just another guy getting through his day, dealing with the same problems we all deal with, wishing things were different but not knowing how to change them. Death works because he makes mortality feel manageable. And in a show that you're watching to fall asleep to, a show designed to lull you into unconsciousness with 3 hours of lore and tangents and gentle rambling, having a version of Death that's more pathetic than frightening is exactly the right creative choice. You're drifting off. you're relaxing. Your brain is letting go of the day's anxieties, and somewhere in the background of the show you're listening to, Death himself is just a regular guy, getting through his shift, heading home to his mum's house, wishing he had more friends. Nothing to be scared of, nothing at all. Speaking of things that seem scary but turn out to be surprisingly comforting, let's talk about the biggest question Family Guy has ever asked. Does the show know it's a show? Because the answer is yes, and the way it handles that knowledge might be the most fascinating thing about the entire series. Family Guy knows it's a TV show, not in the casual wink at the camera way that some shows occasionally break the fourth wall. Family Guy knows it's a TV show in the same way that you know you have hands. It's a constant foundational awareness that informs everything the show does, from its jokes to its structure to its relationship with the audience. The characters reference the writers, they discuss ratings, they acknowledge cancellation, they comment on the animation quality, they critique their own storylines while those storylines are still happening. No other animated show has ever been this aggressively, persistently, almost uncomfortably aware of its own existence as a piece of entertainment. The cancellation and revival story is probably the most important piece of meta-lore in the show's history, because it's a real thing that actually happened, and the show will never let you forget it. Family Guy premiered in 1999 after the Super Bowl and immediately attracted attention for being weird, provocative, and very different from The Simpsons, which was the gold standard for animated comedies at the time. Fox gave it a prime Sunday night slot. It had a strong debut, and then Fox moved it around the schedule repeatedly, bouncing it to different nights and different time slots with the kind of scheduling instability that kills shows. Ratings dropped because nobody could find it. Fox cancelled it after season 2, then Fox brought it back for season 3 based on residual interest, gave it another chance, and cancelled it again. Family Guy was dead. Finished. A cult show that burned bright and died young, destined to be one of those, remember that show? Footnotes in television history. Except something happened that nobody expected. Adult Swim, Cartoon Network's late-night programming block, started airing Family Guy reruns, and people watched, a lot of people. The show found an enormous audience in reruns that it had never been able to build during its original run, partly because Adult Swim's audience was exactly the right demographic for Family Guy's brand of humour, and partly because the show was finally being aired consistently in a time slot where people could find it. Simultaneously, the DVD sales went through the roof. Family Guy DVDs were selling over 2 million copies a year, which was an extraordinary number for any TV show, let alone one that had been cancelled twice. The combination of Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales created something unprecedented in television history. A cancelled show was more popular dead than it had ever been alive. Fox looked at the numbers and made a decision that would change animated comedy forever. They brought Family Guy back from the dead. The show returned in 2005 with the episode North by North Quahog, and the very first thing Peter does is turn to the camera and acknowledge what happened. He tells the audience directly that the show was cancelled and that they tried other shows in Family Guy's time slot, and he names specific Fox shows that had failed. He lists show after show that Fox had bet on instead of Family Guy, and they all bombed. The message is clear and gleeful. You cancelled us, you replaced us, everything you replaced us with failed. And now we're back. It's a victory lap disguised as an opening scene, and it establishes the tone for everything that follows. This show knows it was cancelled. This show knows it was brought back. And this show is never going to stop reminding you of both facts. The cancellation awareness became a permanent part of the show's personality. Characters reference it regularly. Peter has mentioned it in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. The show treats its own near-death experience the way some people treat a serious illness they survived. It becomes part of their identity. It shapes how they see the world. Family Guy almost died, and because it almost died, it now operates with a freedom that shows with more stable histories don't have. It takes bigger risks because it's already been cancelled. What are they going to do? Cancel it again? They already did that twice, and it didn't stick. The Emmy-winning episode from season 16 takes the meta-awareness to its most extreme and self-destructive level. The entire premise is that Peter decides Family Guy should win an Emmy, and he sets out to make the show more like Emmy-winning programs. The episode then parodies every type of show that wins Emmys. They do a Modern Family parody with a mockumentary format. They do a Big Bang Theory parody with a laugh track. They do a Breaking Bad parody, a Game of Thrones parody, a Wire parody, a Homeland parody. Each parody is executed with enough craft to demonstrate that Family Guy could make those kinds of shows, if it wanted to, while simultaneously mocking the idea that those kinds of shows are inherently superior. But here's where it gets really interesting. Bill Maher shows up and tells Peter that there's a conspiracy that the same shows and actors win every year, and Family Guy will never break into the club. Peter investigates and discovers that this is essentially true. The Emmy system is self-reinforcing. The same types of shows get nominated and the same types of shows win, and a show like Family Guy, which doesn't fit neatly into any category and which actively resists the kind of prestige formatting that Emmy voters prefer, will always be on the outside looking in. Then celebrities show up and start listing Family Guy's actual flaws. They criticise the show for borrowing plots from other media. They point out the contrived episode endings. They note that characters of colour have historically been voiced by white actors. These aren't made-up criticisms. These are real complaints that real critics and real audiences have made about the show for years. And Family Guy puts them in the mouths of real celebrities in an episode of Family Guy as part of a storyline about Family Guy trying to win an Emmy. The show is criticising itself while making fun of the system that would judge it, while simultaneously auditioning for that system's approval. It's self-awareness folded into self-criticism, folded into self-promotion, and the layers are genuinely dizzying. The Back to the Pilot episode that we discussed in the time travel section is also a masterwork of meta-awareness. When Brian and Stewie travel back to the first episode, they don't just visit the story of the pilot, they visit the actual production of the pilot. The animation looks different because the animation was different in 1999. The characters comment on how weird everything looks. They notice details that were wrong in the original episode, like the TV not being plugged in, which was a genuine animation error in the actual pilot that fans had pointed out over the years. The show is reviewing its own first episode the way a film school class would review a student film, and it's doing it within the narrative of the show itself. There's a moment in that episode where they look at the original Peter and comment on how he's drawn differently. This is the show acknowledging its own visual evolution in the most literal way possible. Family Guy looks different now than it did in 1999, because animation technology has improved, the art style has been refined, and the budget has increased. Most shows would never draw attention to this because it breaks the illusion that the characters exist in a consistent reality. Family Guy draws attention to it specifically because breaking that illusion is the point. The show doesn't want you to forget you're watching a show. It wants that awareness to be part of the experience. The Simpsons Guy crossover episode is another meta-landmark. Family Guy and The Simpsons have always existed in conversation with each other, partly because they're both animated comedies on Fox, and partly because Family Guy has been accused of ripping off The Simpsons since its inception. Seth MacFarlane has acknowledged the influence, critics have pointed out similarities, fans have debated the comparison for decades, and the crossover episode addresses all of this directly. The Griffins end up in Springfield, they meet the Simpsons, and the two families explicitly discuss the elephant in the room, which is the accusation that Family Guy is a Simpsons clone. The episode doesn't hide from the criticism. It stages a literal fight between Peter and Homer. A physical, destructive, multi-block brawl between the two patriarchs of animated comedy, which is the show's way of literalizing the rivalry that has existed between the two franchises since Family Guy premiered. Peter and Homer beat the hell out of each other, destroy large sections of Springfield, and eventually reach a kind of détente. Neither one wins definitively, because the show is smart enough to know that declaring a winner would alienate half the audience. But the crossover also reveals something important about how Family Guy sees itself in relation to The Simpsons. The Simpsons is the establishment. The Simpsons is the show that proved animated comedies could work on primetime television. The Simpsons built the house that Family Guy lives in. And Family Guy knows this. It's the younger sibling that grew up in the older sibling's shadow and developed a personality that's partly defined by being different from and partly influenced by the original. The crossover episode is an acknowledgement of that dynamic, delivered through the format of both shows simultaneously. The cutaway gag structure is itself a form of meta-awareness that deserves examination. When Peter says, "This is worse than the time I..." and the show cuts to a random, unrelated scenario, the audience is being shown the comedy machinery in real time. You can see the joke being assembled, you can see the setup, the transition, the payoff. There's no attempt to hide the mechanics. The cutaway format is Family Guy showing you its hand and betting that the entertainment value of the gag will compensate for the loss of surprise. And it usually does, because the cutaways are often the funniest part of any given episode. But the cutaways also serve a meta function. They remind you that nothing in this show is sacred. The plot can be interrupted at any time for any reason. The characters' lives can be paused while the show takes a detour into a completely unrelated scenario. The narrative isn't the point. The joke is the point. And the show trusts you to understand this because it has trained you over 20 years to accept cutaways as a fundamental part of how Family Guy communicates. The format itself is a fourth wall break. Every cutaway is the show saying, "We know this isn't how stories are supposed to work, and we're doing it anyway." The Family Guy Through the Years episode is maybe the most ambitious meta-experiment the show has ever attempted. It's a fake retrospective, pretending that Family Guy has been on the air since 1956. The episode shows what Family Guy would have looked like in different decades, with different cultural norms, different animation styles, and different censorship standards. The 1950s version is in black and white, sponsored by a cigarette company, and features the kind of wholesome family dynamics that defined television in that era. The 1970s version is grittier. The 1980s version is more polished. Each decade brings its own version of the show, shaped by the television conventions of that era. This is the show examining not just its own history, but the history of television itself. By imagining what Family Guy would look like in different decades, the episode is asking what makes a show a product of its time. How much of Family Guy's identity comes from the specific cultural moment in which it was created? Would the same show, with the same characters and the same sensibility, work in 1956? In 1972? In 1985? The answer, according to the episode, is that every era shapes its own version of the story. And the Family Guy we know is inseparable from the late 1990s and early 2000s culture that produced it. Disney's The Reboot episode takes the meta-awareness into the territory of corporate self-commentary. After Disney acquired 21st Century Fox, including Family Guy, the show made an episode about Disney trying to reboot the show. Focus groups, corporate executives, brand alignment. The episode shows multiple versions of a rebooted Family Guy, each one warped by corporate priorities and market research into something unrecognizable. A version where Lois is a career executive and Peter is a house husband. a gritty supernatural teen drama version. A version where most of the cast has been fired. Each reboot is terrible in a different way, and the episode's conclusion is that Family Guy should just stay the way it is. The brilliance of this episode is that it's a show owned by Disney, making fun of being owned by Disney. It's corporate self-criticism, produced by the corporation being criticised. Family Guy is using Disney's money and Disney's distribution network to mock Disney's creative instincts, and Disney is apparently fine with this because the episode aired. Either Disney has a great sense of humour about itself, or Disney recognises that allowing Family Guy to mock its corporate parent is actually good for the brand because it reinforces Family Guy's reputation for fearlessness. Either way, the meta implications are staggering. The show is biting the hand that feeds it, and the hand is still feeding. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. One person. One guy from Connecticut doing 4 of the most recognisable voices in animation history, and 3 of them live in the same house. Every conversation between Peter and Brian is one man talking to himself. Every argument between Stewie and Brian is one man arguing with himself. Every moment of emotional connection between any combination of these characters is one performer generating the chemistry by himself in a recording booth. Peter's voice came from a security guard MacFarlane overheard at the Rhode Island School of Design. Just some random guy with a funny way of talking, and MacFarlane thought, that's a character. Brian is essentially MacFarlane's own voice, slightly adjusted. The dog who wants to be a respected writer, who drinks too much, who has progressive political opinions, and a failed creative career. That's the closest thing to a self-portrait MacFarlane has put into the show. And Stewie is Rex Harrison, filtered through MacFarlane's imagination. This clipped British precision that sounds nothing like anything else on television. The fact that one human being generates the vocal performances for all 3 of the show's most complex characters means that every emotional scene between them is essentially a conversation one person is having with different versions of himself. When Brian confesses his suicidal thoughts to Stewie in the bank vault, that's MacFarlane performing vulnerability against his own compassion. When Peter and Brian argue about politics or culture, that's MacFarlane debating himself. When Stewie drops his accent in therapy, that's MacFarlane removing one layer of performance to reveal another layer of performance underneath. This changes the meaning of the show in a subtle but profound way. Family Guy isn't just a cartoon about a dysfunctional family. It's a framework through which one very talented voice actor explores different aspects of personality, intelligence, ambition, failure, and loneliness. The characters feel connected because they literally share a voice box. The chemistry works because there's only one person generating it, which means the rhythms are always perfectly synchronized. And that brings us back to where we started, with the house at 31 Spooner Street and the family that lives inside it. Because after 3 hours of lore, after covering the house and Peter's intelligence and the chicken fights and Stewie's psychology and Brian's crisis and Meg's suffering and the time machine and the multiverse and the family tree and Quahog's economy and death himself and the show's awareness of its own existence, we end up at the same place. Family Guy is a show about people who don't make sense living in a world that doesn't make sense and somehow making it work anyway. The house changes layout every episode, but it always feels like home. Peter's IQ fluctuates wildly, but he always feels like Peter. The show contradicts itself constantly, but it always feels like Family Guy. The consistency isn't in the facts, it's in the feeling. You know you're watching this show within 10 seconds of any episode starting, not because of the animation style or the theme song, but because of the specific energy that no other show has ever replicated. Think about what we've covered tonight. A house that defies architecture. A father who is simultaneously the dumbest and cleverest person in any room. A chicken rivalry that started with a coupon and escalated into time-travelling space battles. A baby whose entire personality is a defence mechanism built to protect a lonely kid from a world that can't understand him. A dog who is desperate to be human and keeps getting reminded he's not. A daughter whose family literally cannot function without someone to abuse. A time machine that's created a mythology more internally consistent than the rest of the show. A multiverse that asks whether your world defines you or you define your world. A family tree that includes connections to every terrible event in American history. An economy built on a stolen beer recipe and sustained by 4 guys at a bar. A version of death who is just some awkward dude trying to get through his shift. And a show that knows it's a show and uses that knowledge as both comedy and philosophy. None of this should work together. It's too many tones, too many genres, too many conflicting ideas about what a television show is supposed to be. A show can be a sitcom or a philosophical exploration of identity. It can be a slapstick comedy or an emotional drama about loneliness. It can be a parody or a genuine narrative. But Family Guy tries to be all of these things, often within the same episode, sometimes within the same scene. And against all odds, it works. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough and well enough that the show has lasted for over 2 decades and shows no sign of stopping. The reason it works, the real reason, underneath all the animation and voice acting and writing, is that Family Guy is honest about what it is. It's a messy show because life is messy. It's contradictory because people are contradictory. It's sometimes brilliant and sometimes terrible because that's what happens when you try to make something new every single week for 20+ years. The show doesn't pretend to be more sophisticated than it is, and it doesn't apologise for being less sophisticated than some people want it to be. It just exists in all its chaotic glory, doing whatever it feels like doing in any given moment and trusting the audience to keep up. The sleep video format is perfect for this kind of show, by the way, and here's why. Family Guy has always been a show you can fall asleep to, not because it's boring, because it's comfortable, the voices are familiar, the rhythms are predictable, even when the content isn't. The cutaway structure means you can drift in and out without losing the thread of anything important, because the show itself drifts in and out of its own threads constantly. Falling asleep to Family Guy lore is like falling asleep to the sound of a friend talking about something they care about. The information is interesting, but the real comfort is the presence. Someone is there. Someone is talking. The world hasn't ended while you are closing your eyes. And speaking of closing your eyes, if you're still awake after 3 hours of this, I'm genuinely impressed. We've been through the entire mythology of Quahog, Rhode Island, from the physical structure of 31 Spooner Street to the metaphysical implications of a show that knows it's a show. We've analysed a baby's therapy session and a chicken's combat record. We've traced a family tree back to the founding of America and forward into alternate dimensions. We've explored how an economy sustains itself on a stolen recipe and how death takes his coffee. Family Guy has been on the air since 1999. It got cancelled twice and came back both times. It survived the transition from network to streaming to whatever comes next. It's been called a masterpiece and a disaster, sometimes in the same review. It's won Emmys and been nominated for others and lost spectacularly. It's been imitated by dozens of shows and outlasted most of them. It's made Seth MacFarlane rich enough to fund his own space documentary and still come back to voice a fat guy from Rhode Island every week. The show will keep going because it can, because the format allows for infinite stories, because the characters are flexible enough to support any kind of plot, because the audience has grown up with these people and doesn't want to let them go. Peter will keep sitting on that couch watching TV. Brian will keep writing novels nobody reads. Stewie will keep building inventions in his nursery. Meg will keep getting ignored. The chicken will keep showing up. Death will keep collecting souls. and the house at 31 Spooner Street will keep looking slightly different every time the camera shows it, because that's just how it works in Quahog. If you're falling asleep right now, that's good. That means this worked. And if you're still awake, well, there's always more Family Guy lore to explore. There are episodes we didn't cover, characters we only mentioned in passing, storylines that deserve their own 3-hour breakdowns. The show has produced hundreds of episodes across more than 2 decades, and every single one of them adds another piece to the giant, messy, beautiful, contradictory puzzle that is this show. So close your eyes. Let the lore settle in. Dream about Quahog if you want to. Dream about a town where anything can happen and nothing has to make sense, and everyone gets to go home at the end of the episode. Dream about 31 Spooner Street, where the staircase is on whatever side it needs to be, and the living room is always warm, and the TV is always on, and Peter is always there, sitting in his spot, waiting for the next cutaway gag to take him somewhere impossible. Good night, Quahog. See you next time. And one last thing before you drift off. The next time you watch a random episode of Family Guy, pay attention to the details we talked about tonight. Look at which side of the house the staircase is on. Listen for the moments when Peter says something accidentally brilliant. Watch how the camera treats Meg differently from everyone else. Notice how Stewie's eyes change when Brian says something that makes him feel safe. Count how many times someone references the fact that Brian is a dog. These details have always been there. You just didn't know what they meant until now, but now you do. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the thing about lore. It changes how you watch everything. 20+ years of episodes, hundreds of hours of content, thousands of characters, jokes, references, callbacks, and contradictions. And all of it started with Seth MacFarlane hearing a funny voice at art school and thinking, I could build a show around that. Sometimes the biggest things in the world start with the smallest moments. A security guard talking in a hallway becomes Peter Griffin. A My Fair Lady impression becomes Stewie. An art school in Rhode Island becomes Quahog. And an expired coupon becomes the greatest rivalry in animation history. That's Family Guy. That's the whole thing right there. Small moments becoming big stories. Stupid jokes hiding smart observations. A cartoon that pretends not to care about anything, caring deeply about everything. It's a mess. It's always been a mess. And maybe that's exactly what makes it perfect. Now go to sleep. You've earned it.